You are not my biological child, so I forgot to put your name in the will, Richard announced at his 65th birthday party, his voice amplified by the microphone and echoing through the grand ballroom. The room erupted in laughter. His country club friends, his business partners, even my mother all laughed. I was the only one who did not. I walked up to the podium, quietly placed my gift on the table, just a single sheet of paper. Then I ripped it to pieces right in front of him. When he managed to piece it back together, his face turned white. Before I tell you what that piece of paper was and how it destroyed everything he had built, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to watch your family's perfect facade crumble. I stood at the back of the elite Oakmont Country Club ballroom, a space dripping with crystal chandeliers and the scent of expensive cologne. There was no slow build-up to this night, no gradual descent into family drama. Evening was already at its peak. Richard, the man who had raised me, the man I had called Dad for 34 years, stood at the podium bathed in a spotlight. He was surrounded by his wealthy peers, men who measured their worth in stock portfolios and summer homes. Howe was giving his grand birthday toast, a speech that had been meticulously planned to highlight his achievements and secure his legacy. As he spoke about the future of his manufacturing empire, he proudly named my younger sister Olivia and her husband Jamal as his sole heirs. They stood near the front, Olivia beaming in a designer dress that cost more than most people's cars, Jamal looking predictably smug. I expected that. I had always been the outsider, the disappointment who chose finance over the family business. But what I did not expect was the pivot. Richard paused, adjusting his tie, a theatrical gesture he used before delivering what he considered a punchline. He looked right at me, his gaze cutting through the crowd. And as for Clara, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. Well, since you are not my biological child, I suppose I forgot to put your name in the will. The silence in the room lasted only a second before the laughter started. It rippled outward from his immediate circle of golf buddies, spreading through the guests. It was a cheap laugh, a cruel joke made at my expense. He had weaponized a secret, my mother's decades-old affair, just to entertain his friends, and officially cut me out of the family in the most humiliating way possible. I did not cry. I did not run out of the double doors behind me, which is exactly what Olivia wanted me to do. I felt the familiar sting of their cruelty, the same sting I had felt my entire life in their pristine suburban mansion, but this time it was different. This time I held the cards. I smoothed the front of my dress and began walking straight up the center aisle toward the podium. The laughter died down as I approached, replaced by confused whispers. Richard's smug smile faltered slightly, but he held his ground, likely expecting me to make a scene, to yell or throw a drink. Instead, I calmly stepped up beside him. I reached out and took the microphone from his hand, the sudden silence in the ballroom deafening. I placed my gift on the podium right in front of him. It was not wrapped in shiny paper or tied with a bow. It was a single legally stamped document. Without breaking eye contact, I took the paper in both hands. I tore it perfectly in half, the sound of tearing paper echoing softly through the microphone. Then I placed the halves together and tore them into quarters, letting the pieces flutter down onto his expensive Italian leather shoes. Richard's face turned a violent shade of red. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice low but furious. I leaned into the microphone, ensuring every person in that room heard my response. "I am doing exactly what you did when you drained my college trust fund to pay for Olivia's first boutique that went bankrupt in 3 months. I am restructuring my investments." Richard scoffed, trying to maintain his composure in front of his audience. "You are being dramatic, Clara. It is just paper." He looked down at the shredded pieces on his shoes, his irritation clear. But as he bent down to brush them away, his eyes caught the distinct gold seal on one of the torn corners. He snatched the pieces up, his hands shaking slightly as he tried to fit them together on the podium. I watched the blood drain completely from his face. The smugness vanished, replaced by sheer panic. He recognized the seal. He recognized the heavy watermarked paper. It was the sole approved transfer deed for the waterfront commercial estate he had been desperately trying to acquire for a decade. It was the crown jewel he needed to cement his legacy, the property that would allow him to expand his manufacturing plant, and double his output. Without that intact original paper, his non-refundable $2 million deposit was completely forfeited by midnight. I saw the realization hit him, the sudden understanding that I held the power to destroy the very legacy he had just proudly announced. I did not wait for him to speak. I turned my back on the silent, gasping crowd and walked back down the aisle, the click of my heels the only sound in the room. I pushed through the heavy oak doors, leaving the chaos behind me. But the night was far from over. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind me, momentarily cutting off the stunned murmurs of the crowd. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air, pulling my phone from my clutch to check the time. 10:45 p.m. I had 75 minutes until Richard's $2 million deposit evaporated. I headed toward the valet stand, my mind already calculating the next moves. Before I could hand my ticket to the attendant, a heavy hand grabbed my arm, spinning me around. It was Jamal. Olivia's husband, Richard's hand-picked VP of operations, and a man who had made a career out of taking credit for other people's work. At 6'2", he usually relied on his physical size to intimidate people, a tactic he was attempting now. "What do you think you are doing, Clara?" Jamal hissed, stepping into my personal space, forcing me to lean back against a decorative stone pillar. "You cannot just destroy corporate property and walk away. That deed belongs to the company." He pointed a finger inches from my face. "You are going to call your boss right now. You are going to get him on the phone, and you are going to issue a new approval deed. If you do not, I swear to God I will have our legal team sue you so fast your head will spin." I looked at his finger, then up at his furious face. I did not flinch. I had spent 34 years dealing with this family's attempts at intimidation. I was immune to it. "Jamal," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "you really should pay more attention to the details." I gently pushed his hand away. "That document was not Richard's corporate property. It was mine." He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "Yours? You are a junior analyst at that equity firm, Clara. You do not own anything. You push paper. Now get your boss on the phone before I ruin your pathetic little career." I adjusted the strap of my clutch, meeting his arrogant stare with cold amusement. "I haven't been a junior analyst since you and Olivia stole the credit for my commercial zoning proposal 5 years ago to secure your VP title." I watched his eyes widen slightly at the mention of the stolen proposal, a secret he thought was safe. "I bought out the majority shares of the commercial private equity firm 2 years ago. I am the senior partner. I am the firm." I leaned in closer, dropping my voice to a whisper. "I am the landlord, Jamal. And I just denied your application." Jamal took a step back, the arrogance suddenly faltering as he processed this information. "That is impossible," he stammered. "Richard checked the ownership structure. The holding company is a series of blind trusts," I finished for him. "Something you should be very familiar with given your recent activities." I opened my clutch and pulled out a small silver flash drive, holding it up between us. "I learned a lot from looking at your financial ledgers when you submitted them for the property review." Jamal's eyes tracked the flash drive, a bead of sweat forming on his forehead. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know exactly how you have been funneling money from Richard's company," I stated clearly. "I know about the offshore LLCs. I know about the inflated vendor invoices. I know you have been siphoning funds to pay for Olivia's extravagant lifestyle, the designer clothes, the trips, the cars." He looked around nervously, ensuring no one was listening, though the valet area remained empty. "You cannot prove anything." "I do not need to," I replied, slipping the flash drive back into my clutch. "The forensic audit on this drive proves everything. It shows a clear trail of embezzlement spanning the last 4 years." I checked my watch again. "It is 10:55 p.m. You have exactly 24 hours. You will resign from your position as VP of Operations, and you will walk away from Richard's company entirely. You will cite personal reasons, health issues, whatever lie you prefer. If you do not step down by tomorrow night, I send this forensic audit directly to the IRS and the FBI." Jamal stood paralyzed, his mouth opening and closing silently. The man who had confidently threatened me minutes ago was now visibly trembling. "Have a good night, Jamal," I said, handing my ticket to the returning valet attendant, And tell Olivia her new sports car looks lovely, even if it was bought with stolen money. I got into my car and drove away, leaving him standing alone in the driveway, the realization of his impending ruin settling over him. As I merged onto the highway, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Richard. I ignored it. I ignored the next 5 calls from him, and the 3 from Olivia. The panic was setting in, and I intended to let them marinate in it. The following morning, I was enjoying a quiet coffee in the kitchen of my luxury penthouse. It was a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a stark contrast to the cramped apartments my family assumed I inhabited. They had never visited perfectly content to believe I was struggling while they thrived. My peace was shattered by the sharp buzzing of the intercom. "Ms. Clara," the concierge's voice sounded strained. "Your mother is here. She slipped past a resident entering the lobby and is demanding to come up." I sighed, setting down my coffee mug. "Send her up, David. It is fine." Minutes later, the elevator doors opened directly into my foyer, revealing Susan. She looked frantic, her makeup slightly smudged, clutching her designer handbag like a lifeline. She stopped short, her eyes scanning the expansive living room, the modern art, the expensive furnishings. She had come prepared to pity me in a cheap studio, and the reality of my success clearly threw her off balance. "Clara," she gasped, rushing forward, her hands reaching out for me. She immediately launched into her performance, the same tearful routine she had used my entire life to manipulate situations. "Clara, please, you have to stop this. You have to issue a new deed." She grabbed my arm, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Richard is beside himself. The $2 million deposit is gone. The company needs that expansion property. You are destroying the family, Clara. Please, you have to save us from this financial ruin." I calmly removed her hands from my arm, stepping back. I felt no sympathy, only a cold, hard detachment. I had spent 34 years watching these tears, and I knew exactly how hollow they were. "Are you going to cry like you did when Richard made me sleep in the unfinished basement, so Olivia could have a second walk-in closet?" I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. "Or are you going to cry like you did when you watched him empty my college fund?" "Save the tears, Susan. They do not work on me anymore." Susan recoiled, her tearful expression morphing into desperation. She realized the emotional manipulation was failing, so she reached for a different weapon. She tried to use the revelation from the party, the secret Richard had so gleefully exposed. "You owe him, Clara," she insisted, her voice hardening. "You owe Richard. He put a roof over your head. He fed you. He clothed you. He raised another man's child as his own. You owe him a debt of gratitude, and this is how you repay him." I let out a short, bitter laugh. A debt of gratitude. I walked over to the marble island in the center of the kitchen and opened a drawer. I pulled out a thick manila folder and slid it across the smooth surface toward her. "I think you will find that any debt between Richard and me has already been paid," I said, "and I am simply collecting the interest." Susan hesitantly opened the folder. On top lay a DNA report confirming what Richard had announced, but beneath it were copies of 30-year-old financial ledgers, legal documents, and corporate filings. She looked up at me, confusion mingling with fear. "What is this?" "I already knew the truth about my paternity, Susan," I said, leaning against the counter. "I have known for years. I knew my biological father was Thomas." I watched the color drain from her face. Thomas had been Richard's original business partner, the brilliant engineer who had designed the very manufacturing processes that made Richard rich. "I also know," I continued, my voice sharp, "that Richard illegally ousted Thomas. I know he forged documents, manipulated the board, and drove my real father to ruin and bankruptcy 30 years ago, effectively stealing the company." Susan stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. She knew. Of course she knew. She had stood by and watched Richard destroy Thomas, just as she had watched him destroy me. "I am not just holding a $12 million property hostage, Susan," I stated clearly. "I am systematically reclaiming the exact value of the shares Richard stole from my biological father, every single penny." Susan stared at me, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on her. The daughter she had dismissed, the child she had allowed to be marginalized, was not just angry, she was executing a decades-old reckoning. "Now," I said, pointing toward the elevator, I have a business to run. Show yourself out. Richard let out a harsh breath that sounded like a cross between a laugh and a sneer. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly, his knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. You are making an absolute fool of yourself, Clara, he said into the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. Throwing a dramatic temper tantrum over a piece of paper just because you cannot handle the truth about your mother. I stood perfectly still. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Even the soft clinking of expensive crystal champagne glasses had completely stopped. It is not just a piece of paper, Richard, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. I suggest you look a little closer at what is currently covering your shoes. He rolled his eyes with an exaggerated sigh, but his gaze dropped to the floor. The bright stage lights caught the heavy gold foil seal on one of the torn quarters resting directly against his polished black leather loafer. I watched the exact second his arrogance fractured into a million pieces. His breath hitched audibly. His fingers went slack. He dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback that made several guests in the front row wince and cover their ears, but Richard did not seem to notice the noise at all. He fell to his knees in his custom-tailored tuxedo. He scrambled frantically to gather the 4 pieces of heavy watermarked cardstock, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he clawed at the floorboards. He placed the torn pieces side by side on the stage, trying desperately to push the jagged edges back together. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin looking ashen and suddenly very old. He recognized the gold seal. He recognized the authorized signature at the bottom. "This is the transfer deed," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly I could barely hear him over the ambient hum of the room. "Yes," I replied, projecting my voice so the guests nearest the stage could hear every single word. "The sole approved transfer deed for the Harbor Point commercial estate. The $12 million waterfront property you have been trying to get your hands on for a decade." "You cannot do this!" he gasped, looking up at me from his knees, his eyes wide with sheer panic. "The closing is tomorrow morning. If I do not have the original approved deed submitted to the escrow account by midnight tonight, my deposit is completely forfeited. $2 million in non-refundable earnest money," I said, stating the fact clearly and coldly. "Money you pulled directly from the company pension fund, assuming this real estate deal was a guaranteed success." He stared at me in absolute horror. He knew exactly what this meant. Without the Harbor Point expansion, his entire manufacturing empire was trapped. He had already signed massive contracts with overseas distributors promising output from a facility he did not yet own. Without that building, his supply chain would collapse by next quarter, and the board of directors would crucify him. "You are going to ruin me," he said, his voice cracking. "No," I corrected him, stepping away from the podium. "You ruined yourself when you decided my future was acceptable collateral damage for Olivia's shopping habits. You just did not think I would ever have the power to collect on the debt." I stepped around him, leaving the man who had mocked me my entire life, kneeling helplessly in the shredded remains of his legacy. I walked down the short steps of the stage and headed straight down the center aisle. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted for me like the Red Sea. No one was laughing now. The mocking whispers were completely gone, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. I saw Olivia standing near the front table, her mouth hanging open in shock, her designer clutch dropped and forgotten on the floor. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom, stepping into the quiet marble hallway of the country club. The cool air conditioning hit my flush skin. I felt an incredible surge of adrenaline. I had done it. After 34 years of being the scapegoat, the afterthought, the convenient punchline, I had finally taken my power back. I checked my phone. It was 10:45 in the evening. He had exactly 75 minutes until that $2 million deposit vanished into thin air. I slipped my phone back into my purse and headed toward the grand lobby to retrieve my car from the valet. But the night was far from over. Before I could reach the glass revolving doors at the front entrance, heavy footsteps pounded on the marble floor behind me. A large hand clamped down hard on my shoulder and spun me around with enough force to make me stumble backward. It was Jamal, Olivia's husband and Richard's arrogant vice president of operations. At over 6 feet tall, he deliberately stepped into my personal space, using his physical size to block my path to the exit. His face was twisted with rage. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Clara Jamal demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the empty lobby. "You cannot just destroy corporate property and walk away like nothing happened. That deed belongs to the holding company." He pointed a thick finger inches from my face, his expression furious and entitled. Jamal was a man who had built his entire career on taking credit for the hard work of others, mostly mine, and he was entirely used to bullying his way out of any problem. "You are going to call your boss right now," Jamal ordered, treating me exactly like the incompetent subordinate he always believed I was. "You are going to get the senior partner of your private equity firm on the phone, and you are going to force him to issue a new approval deed tonight. If you do not, I swear to God, I will have our legal team sue you for damages so fast your head will spin. You will be paying us for the rest of your pathetic little career." I looked at his pointing finger and then up at his furious face. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I had spent my entire adult life dealing with this family's relentless attempts at intimidation. I was completely immune to it now. "Jamal," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "you really should pay more attention to the financial details." I gently but firmly pushed his hand away from my face. That document was not Richard's corporate property, it was mine. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, throwing his head back. "Yours. You are a junior analyst, Clara. You do not own anything. You push paper for a living. Now get your boss on the phone before I ruin you." I adjusted the strap of my clutch, meeting his arrogant stare with cold amusement. "I have not been a junior analyst since you and Olivia stole the credit for my commercial zoning proposal 5 years ago to secure your vice president title." I watched his eyes widen slightly at the mention of the stolen proposal, a dirty secret he thought was buried forever. "I bought out the majority shares of the commercial private equity firm 2 years ago." I continued, watching the confusion spread across his features. "I am the senior partner. I am the firm. I am the landlord, Jamal. And I just denied your application." Richard let out a harsh breath that sounded like a cross between a laugh and a sneer. He gripped the edges of the wooden podium so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly shade of white. "You are making an absolute fool of yourself, Clara," he said into the microphone, his voice booming through the speakers. "Throwing a dramatic temper tantrum over a piece of paper just because you cannot handle the truth about your mother." I stood perfectly still. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Even the soft clinking of expensive crystal champagne glasses had completely stopped. "It is not just a piece of paper, Richard," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "I suggest you look a little closer at what is currently covering your shoes." He rolled his eyes with an exaggerated sigh, but his gaze dropped to the floor. The bright stage lights caught the heavy gold foil seal on one of the torn quarters, resting directly against his polished black leather loafer. I watched the exact second his arrogance fractured into a million pieces. His breath hitched audibly. His fingers went slack. He dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage floor with a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback that made several guests in the front row wince and cover their ears, but Richard did not seem to notice the noise at all. He fell to his knees in his custom-tailored tuxedo. He scrambled frantically to gather the 4 pieces of heavy watermarked cardstock, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he clawed at the floorboards. He placed the torn pieces side by side on the stage, trying desperately to push the jagged edges back together. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving his skin looking ashen and suddenly very old. He recognized the gold seal. He recognized the authorized signature at the bottom. "This is the transfer deed," he whispered, his voice trembling so badly I could barely hear him over the ambient hum of the room. "Yes," I replied, projecting my voice so the guests nearest the stage could hear every single word. "The sole approved transfer deed for the Harbor Point commercial estate, the $12 million waterfront property you have been trying to get your hands on for a decade." "You cannot do this!" he gasped, looking up at me from his knees, his eyes wide with sheer panic. "The closing is tomorrow morning. If I do not have the original approved deed submitted to the escrow account by midnight tonight, my deposit is completely forfeited. $2 million in non-refundable earnest money," I said, stating the fact clearly and coldly. Money you pulled directly from the company pension fund, assuming this real estate deal was a guaranteed success. He stared at me in absolute horror. He knew exactly what this meant. Without the Harbor Point expansion, his entire manufacturing empire was trapped. He had already signed massive contracts with overseas distributors promising output from a facility he did not yet own. Without that building, his supply chain would collapse by next quarter, and the board of directors would crucify him. "You will call the holding firm right now," he demanded, his voice rising in a desperate pitch as he tried to stand back up. His knees wobbled slightly. "You will call them and authorize a duplicate deed. You work for them, Clara. You can fix this." "There are no duplicates," Richard, I said, watching the sheer terror wash over his features. "I made absolutely sure of that before I walked into this room tonight. The board required the original physical document for the final transfer, and you are currently holding it in 4 separate pieces. You are going to ruin me," he said, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "No," I corrected him, stepping away from the podium. "You ruined yourself when you decided my future was acceptable collateral damage for Olivia's shopping habits and Jamal's terrible business investments. You just did not think I would ever have the power to collect on the debt." I stepped around him, leaving the man who had mocked me my entire life, kneeling helplessly in the shredded remains of his legacy. I walked down the short steps of the stage and headed straight down the center aisle. The crowd of wealthy socialites parted for me like the Red Sea. No one was laughing now. The mocking whispers were completely gone, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. I saw Olivia standing near the front table, her mouth hanging open in shock, her designer clutch dropped and forgotten on the floor. Her husband Jamal was already pushing his chair back, his face twisted in fury. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors of the ballroom, stepping into the quiet marble hallway of the country club. The cool air conditioning hit my flushed skin. I felt an incredible surge of adrenaline. I had done it. After 34 years of being the scapegoat, the afterthought, the convenient punchline, I had finally taken my power back. I checked my phone. It was 10:45 in the evening. He had exactly 75 minutes until that $2 million deposit vanished into thin air. I slipped my phone back into my purse and headed toward the grand lobby to retrieve my car from the valet. But the night was far from over. Before I could reach the glass revolving doors at the front entrance, heavy footsteps pounded on the marble floor behind me. A large hand clamped down hard on my shoulder and spun me around with enough force to make me stumble backward. It was Jamal, Olivia's husband and Richard's arrogant vice president of operations. At over 6 feet tall, he deliberately stepped into my personal space, using his physical size to block my path to the exit. His face was twisted with rage. "What the hell do you think you are doing, Clara?" Jamal demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the empty lobby. "You cannot just destroy corporate property and walk away like nothing happened. That deed belongs to the holding company." He pointed a thick finger inches from my face, his expression furious and entitled. Jamal was a man who had built his entire career on taking credit for the hard work of others, mostly mine, and he was entirely used to bullying his way out of any problem. "You are going to call your boss right now," Jamal ordered, treating me exactly like the incompetent subordinate he always believed I was. "You are going to get the senior partner of your private equity firm on the phone, and you are going to force him to issue a new approval deed tonight. If you do not, I swear to God, I will have our legal team sue you for damages so fast, your head will spin. You will be paying us for the rest of your pathetic little career." I looked at his pointing finger and then up at his furious face. I did not flinch. I did not back away. I had spent my entire adult life dealing with this family's relentless attempts at intimidation. I was completely immune to it now. "Jamal," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, "you really should pay more attention to the financial details." I gently but firmly pushed his hand away from my face. That document was not Richard's corporate property. It was mine. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh, throwing his head back. "Yours. You are a junior analyst, Clara. You do not own anything. You push paper for a living. Now get your boss on the phone before I ruin you." I adjusted the strap of my clutch, meeting his arrogant stare with cold amusement. I have not been a junior analyst since you and Olivia stole the credit for my commercial zoning proposal 5 years ago to secure your vice president title. I watched his eyes widen slightly at the mention of the stolen proposal, a dirty secret he thought was buried forever. I bought out the majority shares of the commercial private equity firm 2 years ago. I continued watching the confusion spread across his features. I am the senior partner. I am the firm. I am the landlord, Jamal. And I just denied your application. The heavy oak doors of the Oakmont Country Club ballroom swung shut behind me, cutting off the immediate chaos. The thick acoustic paneling muffled the shouts and frantic murmurs erupting from Richard's table, but the sudden silence of the grand lobby felt even louder. My heart hammered a steady, confident rhythm against my ribs. For the first time in my 34 years, I did not feel the crushing weight of family expectations dragging me down. I adjusted the strap of my evening clutch and walked across the imported Persian rugs toward the front entrance. The valet stand was just visible through the floor-to-ceiling glass doors. I just needed to hand over my ticket and drive away. Before I could even reach into my purse, the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps slapped against the polished marble floor behind me. Someone was running. A large hand clamped down hard on my bare shoulder. The grip was punishing. The fingers dug into my skin with enough force to make me stumble backward. I was spun around violently. It was Jamal. Olivia's husband and Richard's hand-picked vice president of operations stood towering over me. At 6 feet 2 inches tall, Jamal usually carried himself with a smooth, practiced charm that he used to manipulate clients and charm board members. Tonight, that charm was completely gone. His custom-tailored tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned, and his breathing was ragged. His face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped directly into my personal space, deliberately using his physical size to block my path to the exit. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" Clara Jamal demanded, his voice echoing harshly off the vaulted ceilings of the empty lobby. "You cannot just destroy corporate property and walk away like nothing happened." He pointed a thick finger just inches from my face. I could smell the sharp tang of his expensive cologne, mixed with the sour scent of nervous sweat. Jamal was a man who had built his entire career on taking credit for the hard work of others. He married my sister to secure his place in the family hierarchy, and spent the last 5 years acting as Richard's loyal attack dog. He was entirely used to bullying his way out of any problem, and he clearly expected me to shrink back and apologize. I did not flinch. I did not step away. I looked at his pointing finger and then raised my eyes to meet his furious stare. I had spent my entire adult life dealing with this family's relentless attempts at intimidation. I used to let Jamal talk down to me at family dinners. I used to bite my tongue when he made condescending jokes about my modest apartment or my choice to work at a private equity firm instead of begging Richard for a handout. But tonight, I was completely immune to his tactics. "You are going to fix this right now," Jamal ordered, his volume increasing as he tried to rattle my composure. "You are going to get on your phone, and you are going to call your boss. You are going to get the senior partner of your firm on the line and tell him there was an administrative error. You will force him to issue a new approval deed tonight." I watched him practically hyperventilate as he spoke. He was projecting his own terror onto me. If Richard lost that $12 million property, the company would tank, and Jamal's lavish lifestyle would disappear overnight. He needed me to be the frightened little sister. He needed me to submit. "I am not calling anyone Jamal," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and quiet. The contrast between my absolute calm and his erratic anger only seemed to infuriate him more. "You do not have a choice," he spat, taking another aggressive step forward, forcing me to lean slightly against a decorative stone pillar. "Do you have any idea what you just did in there? That document belongs to the holding company. You stole a legally binding corporate asset and destroyed it in front of 50 witnesses. My legal team will sue you for damages so fast your head will spin. We will drag you into court and absolutely bankrupt you. You will be paying us for the rest of your pathetic little career." He was trying to drown me in legal threats, hoping my lack of resources would force me to surrender. He still viewed me as the struggling analyst who scraped by on a junior salary. He thought Richard's wealth was an impenetrable shield that allowed them to crush anyone who stepped out of line. Get your phone out, Clara Jamal commanded, extending his hand, palm up as if expecting me to simply hand over my device. Call your managing director. Tell him you had a mental breakdown. Tell him you made a mistake. If you do not get a duplicate deed sent over to the escrow account by midnight, I will personally make sure you never work in finance again. Richard has connections. He knows the partners at your firm. We will have you fired and blacklisted by tomorrow morning. He scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. You are a glorified secretary, Clara. You push paper for a living. You only got that job because Richard made a phone call and asked them to take pity on his estranged daughter. You have no real power. You have no authority. You are nothing but a minor inconvenience that I am going to squash if you do not do exactly what I say. A couple of country club staff members peeked out from the coat check room, their eyes wide as they witnessed the confrontation. Jamal noticed them and puffed out his chest, standing taller, attempting to use the public audience to shame me into compliance. He wanted me to feel small. He wanted me to remember my place at the bottom of the family ladder. I maintained my relaxed posture, letting my hands rest loosely at my sides. The sheer arrogance radiating from him was almost comical. He was so utterly convinced of his own superiority that he had completely blinded himself to the reality of the situation. He thought he was cornering a helpless animal. He had no idea he had just walked directly into a trap. You really believe you hold all the cards here, do you not, Jamal? I asked, tilting my head slightly. You think because you wear a fancy title that my sister bought for you that you actually understand how this industry works. I am the vice president of operations, he growled, slamming his fist against the stone pillar next to my head in a blatant display of physical aggression. I run the logistics for a multi-million-dollar manufacturing empire. I know exactly how things work. I know that when a low-level employee goes rogue and destroys a transfer deed, they get fired and sued into oblivion. Now stop stalling and make the call. I let out a slow, steady breath. The time for playing the quiet, submissive sister was officially over. I looked directly into his angry, panicked eyes and prepared to dismantle his entire reality piece by piece. Jamal stared at me. The arrogant sneer that usually rested so comfortably on his features melted away entirely, replaced by a slack-jawed mask of pure cognitive dissonance. He shook his head, using a jerky and mechanical motion, as if he were trying to physically dislodge my words from his brain. He took a half-step backward, his broad shoulders hunching inward. You are lying, he sputtered, though his voice completely lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin and reedy, echoing weakly in the expansive lobby. Richard had his top lawyers vet the holding company. The ownership structure was buried behind a massive labyrinth of shell corporations and blind trusts. There is absolutely no way you could be the owner. You do not have that kind of capital. Exactly, I interrupted, taking a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to either hold his ground or retreat further. Blind trusts. A legal concept you and my father use frequently to hide your personal assets, but one that works equally well for protecting legitimate investments from prying eyes. I required absolute anonymity when I finalized the acquisition of the firm. I knew perfectly well that if Richard saw my name anywhere near that $12 million property, his fragile ego would never allow him to proceed with the deal. He would have backed out and tanked his own expansion plans just to spite me. I let him walk blindly into the trap. I watched his Adam's apple bob nervously as he swallowed hard. A fine sheen of sweat began to bead on his forehead, gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. But let us talk a little more about those blind trusts of yours, Jamal, I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost friendly tone that made him flinch. Like I just said, I learned a great deal from looking at your financial ledgers when you submitted them for the property review. Jamal wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He looked frantically over his shoulder, terrified that someone from the ballroom might have wandered out into the lobby and overheard us. Those ledgers were strictly confidential corporate documents. He hissed, his panic rising to the surface. You had absolutely no right to audit our internal operating accounts. That is a breach of corporate privacy. When a prospective commercial tenant wants to lease a $12 million waterfront property from my firm, I have every legal right to perform a deep forensic audit on their financials to ensure they are solvent. I explained patiently, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. I reached into my evening clutch and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. I held it up between us, holding it by the edges so it caught the ambient light of the lobby. It is truly amazing what you can find when you actually do the hard work yourself instead of stealing the credit for it from your juniors, I said, tapping the flash drive against my manicured fingernail. Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands under your maiden name. Heavily inflated vendor invoices from supply chains that mysteriously share a registered billing address with Olivia's bankrupt clothing boutique. Massive unexplained consulting fees paid out monthly to limited liability companies that have absolutely zero digital footprint. Jamal stopped breathing. He stood completely paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the small silver drive in my hand, as if it were a live grenade ready to detonate. I know exactly how you have been systematically funneling money out of Richard's manufacturing company, I stated, my words clipping through the air with absolute certainty. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the falsified expense reports. I know you have been quietly siphoning corporate funds to pay for Olivia's extravagant lifestyle because your salary alone could never cover the designer clothes, the European vacations, and the luxury cars she demands. You cannot prove anything, he whispered, his voice shaking so badly it was barely audible. You are bluffing, Clara. You do not have access to the primary banking routing numbers. I do not need to bluff, Jamal, I replied smoothly, slipping the flash drive back into my clutch and snapping it shut. The forensic audit on this drive proves everything beyond a shadow of a doubt. It outlines a crystal-clear, meticulously documented trail of corporate embezzlement spanning the last 4 years. I have bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and digital signatures that tie every single stolen dollar directly back to you. I checked my watch, noting the time with cold satisfaction. It is now 10:55 in the evening. Richard's earnest money deposit is officially gone, but your night is about to get significantly worse. You have exactly 24 hours to submit your formal resignation as Vice President of Operations. Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. You will cite personal reasons. I continued, dictating the terms of his surrender. You can claim sudden health issues. You can say you have a deep desire to spend more time with your family. I do not care what pathetic lie you spin for the industry press release. But you will step down from your position, and you will walk away from Richard's company, entirely relinquishing all of your stock options and severing all ties. You cannot do this to me, he pleaded, all his former arrogance entirely evaporated. I built that logistics department from the ground up. If I resign without a severance package, Olivia will leave me. She will not stay if the money is gone. If you do not step down and clear out your office by tomorrow night, I will send the unredacted forensic audit on this drive directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I said, my tone offering zero room for negotiation. Embezzling a few $1 million from your arrogant father-in-law is a messy family matter. Defrauding federal tax authorities through offshore shell companies is a severe felony, carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. You can either lose your job or you can lose your freedom. The choice is entirely yours. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him and walked out the glass doors into the cool night air, just as the valet pulled my car up to the curb. I handed the attendant my ticket and a generous tip. Before getting into the driver's seat, I looked back at Jamal, who was still standing frozen in the lobby, looking like a man who had just watched his own execution. Tell Olivia her new sports car looks lovely, I called out over the roof of my car. It is a real shame she bought it with stolen money. I slipped into the leather seat, started the engine and drove away, leaving the country club and the chaos of my family far behind me. As I merged onto the highway, my phone began to buzz relentlessly in the center console. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. I ignored it. 5 minutes later it rang again, displaying Olivia's number. Then Jamal's. Then Richard's again. The sheer panic was setting in over them like a thick, suffocating blanket, and I intended to let them marinate in that terror for the rest of the night. The following morning, I was standing in the kitchen of my luxury penthouse, enjoying a quiet cup of espresso. The sprawling open concept space featured soaring floor-to-ceiling windows that offered an unobstructed panoramic view of the city skyline. The morning sunlight poured over the pristine white marble countertops and the imported modern furnishings. It was a stark, absolute contrast to the cramped, run-down studio apartments my family always assumed I inhabited. They had never once bothered to visit me, perfectly content to blindly believe I was struggling financially while they thrived in their suburban mansions. My peaceful morning routine was shattered by the sharp buzzing sound of the security intercom mounted on the wall. I walked over and pressed the receiver button. "Ms. Clara." The building concierge's voice sounded strained and apologetic through the speaker. "I am so sorry to disturb you, but your mother is down here in the lobby. She slipped past a resident entering through the revolving doors, and she is aggressively demanding to come up to your unit. I can have security escort her off the premises if you prefer." I sighed, setting my espresso cup down on the marble island. "Send her up, David," I said, leaning against the counter. "It is fine." Less than 2 minutes later, the private elevator doors opened directly into my personal foyer, revealing Susan. She looked incredibly frantic. Her usually pristine makeup was slightly smudged under her eyes, and she was clutching her designer leather handbag against her chest like a protective shield. She rushed out of the elevator but stopped dead in her tracks as she crossed the threshold. Her eyes darted wildly around the expansive living room, taking in the original modern art hanging on the walls, the vaulted ceilings, and the sheer undeniable wealth of the space. She had clearly come prepared to pity me in some cheap, dingy apartment, and the shocking reality of my success completely threw her off balance. She blinked several times, trying to process the disconnect between her assumptions and the truth. "Clara," she gasped, finally recovering her ability to speak. She rushed forward across the hardwood floor, reaching her hands out toward me. She immediately launched into her signature performance, the exact same tearful, dramatic routine she had weaponized my entire life to manipulate situations and avoid accountability. "Clara, please, you have to stop this madness," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes, perfectly on cue. "You have to call whoever is in charge and issue a new deed right now. Richard is completely beside himself. The $2 million deposit is gone, and the bank is threatening to pull his commercial credit lines. The company desperately needs that expansion property to survive the quarter. You are destroying the family, Clara. Please, you have to fix this and save us from financial ruin." I stood perfectly still, calmly, removing her grasping hands from my forearms and taking a deliberate step backward. I looked at her tear-streaked face and felt absolutely nothing. No sympathy, no guilt, only a cold, hard detachment born from decades of neglect. I had spent 34 years watching these exact same fake tears, and I knew exactly how hollow and calculated they were. "Are you going to cry like you did when Richard forced me to sleep in the unfinished basement for 3 years, just so Olivia could have a second walk-in closet for her shoes?" I asked, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "Or are you going to cry like you did when you stood silently by and watched him empty out my entire college trust fund to pay off Olivia's credit card debt? Save the theatrical tears, Susan. They do not work on me anymore." Susan recoiled, stepping back as if physically struck. Her tearful, pleading expression rapidly morphed into hard-cornered desperation. She realized instantly that the emotional manipulation tactic was failing, so she seamlessly reached for a different weapon. She tried to use the humiliating revelation from the birthday party, the very secret Richard had so gleefully exposed to the crowd, to guilt me into submission. "You owe him, Clara," she insisted, her voice losing its tremor and hardening into a sharp command. "You owe Richard everything. He put a roof over your head for 18 years. He fed you, he clothed you, he spent his hard-earned money raising another man's child as his own when he did not have to. You owe him a massive debt of gratitude, and this is how you repay his generosity." I let out a short, bitter laugh, shaking my head at her sheer audacity. A debt of gratitude. I walked around the marble island to the custom cabinetry and opened a heavy oak drawer. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila folder and slid it across the smooth stone surface until it rested directly in front of her trembling hands. "I think you will find that any perceived debt between Richard and me has already been paid in full," I said, watching her stare nervously at the document. "And I am simply collecting the interest." Jamal stared at me, his jaw going completely slack. The arrogant sneer that usually rested so comfortably on his features melted away, entirely replaced by a mask of pure cognitive dissonance. He shook his head using a jerky mechanical motion, as if he were trying to physically dislodge my words from his brain. He took a half step backward, his broad shoulders hunching inward. "You are lying," he sputtered, though his voice completely lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin and reedy, echoing weakly in the expansive marble lobby. Richard had his top lawyers vet the holding company. The ownership structure was buried behind a massive labyrinth of shell corporations and blind trusts. There is absolutely no way you could be the owner. You do not have that kind of capital. Exactly, I interrupted, taking a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to either hold his ground or retreat further. Blind trusts. A legal concept you and my father use frequently to hide your personal assets, but one that works equally well for protecting legitimate investments from prying eyes. I required absolute anonymity when I finalized the acquisition of the firm. I knew perfectly well that if Richard saw my name anywhere near that $12 million property, his fragile ego would never allow him to proceed with the deal. He would have backed out and tanked his own expansion plans just to spite me. I let him walk blindly into the trap. I watched his throat swallow hard. A fine sheen of sweat began to bead on his forehead, gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. "But let us talk a little more about those blind trusts of yours, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost friendly tone that made him flinch visibly. "Like I just said, I learned a great deal from looking at your financial ledgers when you submitted them for the property review." Jamal wiped his brow with the back of his hand. He looked frantically over his shoulder, terrified that someone from the ballroom might have wandered out into the lobby and overheard us. "Those ledgers were strictly confidential corporate documents," he hissed, his panic rising to the surface. "You had absolutely no right to audit our internal operating accounts. That is a breach of corporate privacy. When a prospective commercial tenant wants to lease a $12 million waterfront property from my firm, I have every legal right to perform a deep forensic audit on their financials to ensure they are solvent." I explained, patiently, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. I reached into my evening clutch and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. I held it up between us by the edges, so it caught the ambient light of the lobby. "It is truly amazing what you can find when you actually do the hard work yourself instead of stealing the credit for it from your juniors," I said, tapping the flash drive against my manicured fingernail. "Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands under your mother's maiden name. Heavily inflated vendor invoices from supply chains that mysteriously share a registered billing address with Olivia's bankrupt clothing boutique. Massive unexplained consulting fees paid out monthly to limited liability companies that have absolutely zero digital footprint." Jamal stopped breathing. He stood completely paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the small silver drive in my hand as if it were a live grenade ready to detonate. "I know exactly how you have been systematically funneling money out of Richard's manufacturing company," I stated, my words clipping through the air with absolute certainty. "I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the falsified expense reports. I know you have been quietly siphoning corporate funds to pay for Olivia's extravagant lifestyle because your salary alone could never cover the designer clothes, the European vacations, and the luxury cars she demands. You cannot prove anything," he whispered, his voice shaking so badly it was barely audible. "You are bluffing, Clara. You do not have access to the primary banking routing numbers." "I do not need to bluff, Jamal," I replied smoothly, slipping the flash drive back into my clutch and snapping it shut. The sharp click of the metal clasp echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. "The forensic audit on this drive proves everything beyond a shadow of a doubt. It outlines a crystal clear, meticulously documented trail of corporate embezzlement spanning the last 4 years. I have bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and digital signatures that tie every single stolen dollar directly back to you." I checked my watch, noting the time with cold satisfaction. It is now 10:55 in the evening. Richard's earnest money deposit is officially gone, but your night is about to get significantly worse. You have exactly 24 hours to submit your formal resignation as Vice President of Operations. Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. You will cite personal reasons. I continued dictating the terms of his surrender. You can claim sudden health issues. You can say you have a deep desire to spend more time with your family. I do not care what pathetic lie you spin for the industry press release. But you will step down from your position, and you will walk away from Richard's company, entirely relinquishing all of your stock options and severing all ties. You cannot do this to me, he pleaded, all his former arrogance entirely evaporated. I built that logistics department from the ground up. If I resign without a severance package, Olivia will leave me. She will not stay if the money is gone. If you do not step down and clear out your office by tomorrow night, I will send the unredacted forensic audit on this drive directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I said, my tone offering zero room for negotiation. Embezzling a few $1 million from your arrogant father-in-law is a messy family matter. Defrauding federal tax authorities through offshore shell companies is a severe felony carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. You can either lose your job or you can lose your freedom. The choice is entirely yours. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him and walked out the glass doors into the cool night air, just as the valet pulled my charcoal gray Aston Martin up to the curb. I saw Jamal flinch out of the corner of my eye as he registered the hood ornament, realizing just how completely he and my family had underestimated my financial reality. I handed the attendant my ticket and a generous tip. Before getting into the driver's seat, I looked back at Jamal, who was still standing frozen in the lobby, looking like a man who had just watched his own execution. Tell Olivia her new sports car looks lovely, I called out over the roof of my car. It is a real shame she bought it with stolen money. I slipped into the leather seat, started the engine and drove away, leaving the country club and the chaos of my family far behind me. As I merged onto the highway, my phone began to buzz relentlessly in the center console. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. I ignored it. 5 minutes later, it rang again, displaying Olivia's number, then Jamal's, then Richard's again. The sheer panic was setting in over them like a thick, suffocating blanket, and I intended to let them marinate in that terror for the rest of the night. Jamal stood frozen as the weight of my words finally penetrated his thick skull. His mouth opened and closed silently, resembling a fish pulled fresh from the harbor. The arrogant sneer that usually rested so comfortably on his features melted away entirely, replaced by a mask of pure cognitive dissonance. He shook his head using a jerky mechanical motion, as if he were trying to physically dislodge my statement from his brain. He took a half step backward, his broad shoulders hunching inward. "You are lying!" he sputtered, though his voice completely lacked its previous booming authority. It sounded thin and reedy, echoing weakly in the expansive marble lobby. Richard had his top lawyers vet the holding company. The ownership structure was buried behind a massive labyrinth of shell corporations and blind trusts. There is absolutely no way you could be the owner. You do not have that kind of capital. Exactly. I interrupted, taking a deliberate step toward him, forcing him to either hold his ground or retreat further. Blind trusts. A legal concept you and my father use frequently to hide your personal assets, but one that works equally well for protecting legitimate investments from prying eyes. I required absolute anonymity when I finalized the acquisition of the firm. I knew perfectly well that if Richard saw my name anywhere near that $12 million property, his fragile ego would never allow him to proceed with the deal. He would have backed out and tanked his own expansion plans just to spite me. I let him walk blindly into the trap. I watched his throat swallow hard. A fine sheen of sweat began to bead on his forehead, gleaming under the crystal chandeliers. He looked frantically over his shoulder, terrified that someone from the ballroom might have wandered out into the lobby and overheard us. "But let us talk a little more about those blind trusts of yours, Jamal," I said, my voice dropping to a conversational, almost friendly tone that made him flinch visibly. "Like I just said, I learned a great deal from looking at your financial ledgers when you submitted them for the property review. Those ledgers were strictly confidential corporate documents," he hissed, his panic rising to the surface, fighting a losing battle against his crumbling bravado. "You had absolutely no right to audit our internal operating accounts. That is a breach of corporate privacy, and I will have you disbarred from the financial sector. When a prospective commercial tenant wants to lease a $12 million waterfront property from my firm, I have every legal right to perform a deep forensic audit on their financials to ensure they are solvent. I explained patiently, speaking to him as if he were a slow child. I reached into my evening clutch and pulled out a small, sleek silver flash drive. I held it up between us by the edges so it caught the ambient light of the lobby. It is truly amazing what you can find when you actually do the hard work yourself, instead of stealing the credit for it from your juniors, I said, tapping the flash drive against my manicured fingernail. Shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands under your mother's maiden name. Heavily inflated vendor invoices from supply chains that mysteriously share a registered billing address with Olivia's bankrupt clothing boutique. Massive, unexplained consulting fees paid out monthly to limited liability companies that have absolutely zero digital footprint. Jamal stopped breathing. He stood completely paralyzed, his eyes locked onto the small silver drive in my hand, as if it were a live grenade ready to detonate. The ambient noise of the country club seemed to fade away, leaving only the sharp intake of his breath. I know exactly how you have been systematically funneling money out of Richard's manufacturing company, I stated, my words clipping through the air with absolute certainty. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the falsified expense reports. I know you have been quietly siphoning corporate funds to pay for Olivia's extravagant lifestyle, because your salary alone could never cover the designer clothes, the European vacations, and the luxury cars she demands to keep up appearances with her socialite friends. You cannot prove anything, he whispered, his voice shaking so badly it was barely audible. You are bluffing, Clara. You do not have access to the primary banking routing numbers. You are just trying to scare me because you are bitter. I do not need to bluff, Jamal, I replied smoothly, slipping the flash drive back into my clutch and snapping it shut. The sharp click of the metal clasp echoed loudly in the quiet space. The forensic audit on this drive proves everything beyond a shadow of a doubt. It outlines a crystal-clear, meticulously documented trail of corporate embezzlement spanning the last 4 years. I have bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and digital signatures that tie every single stolen dollar directly back to you. I even have the email threads where you instructed the accounting department to overlook the discrepancies. I checked my watch, noting the time with cold satisfaction. It is now 10:55 in the evening. Richard's earnest money deposit is officially gone. But your night is about to get significantly worse. You have exactly 24 hours to submit your formal resignation as Vice President of Operations. Jamal opened his mouth to protest, but no sound came out. His large frame seemed to shrink under the weight of his impending ruin. You will cite personal reasons. I continued, dictating the terms of his surrender. You can claim sudden health issues. You can say you have a deep desire to spend more time with your family. I do not care what pathetic lie you spin for the industry press release. But you will step down from your position, and you will walk away from Richard's company, entirely relinquishing all of your stock options and severing all ties. You cannot do this to me, he pleaded. All his former arrogance entirely evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, terrified man. I built that logistics department from the ground up. If I resign without a severance package, Olivia will leave me. She will not stay if the money is gone. You know how she is, Clara. She will take everything. If you do not step down and clear out your office by tomorrow night, I will send the unredacted forensic audit on this drive directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I said, my tone offering zero room for negotiation. Embezzling a few $1 million from your arrogant father-in-law is a messy family matter. Defrauding federal tax authorities through offshore shell companies is a severe felony carrying mandatory minimum sentencing. You can either lose your job or you can lose your freedom. The choice is entirely yours. I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on him and walked out the glass doors into the cool night air, just as the valet pulled my charcoal gray sports car up to the curb. The sleek, aggressive lines of the vehicle gleamed under the exterior lights. I saw Jamal flinch out of the corner of my eye as he registered the expensive vehicle, realizing just how completely he and my family had underestimated my financial reality. I handed the attendant my ticket and a generous tip. Before getting into the driver's seat, I looked back at Jamal, who was still standing frozen in the lobby, looking like a man who had just watched his own execution. He looked small and pathetic, bathed in the harsh light of his own consequences. "Tell Olivia her new sports car looks lovely," I called out over the roof of my car. "It is a real shame she bought it with stolen money." I slipped into the leather seat, started the engine, and drove away, leaving the country club and the chaos of my family far behind me. The quiet hum of the engine was the only sound as I merged onto the highway. A few minutes later, my phone began to buzz relentlessly in the center console. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. I ignored it. 5 minutes later, it rang again, displaying Olivia's number, then Jamal's, then Richard's again. The sheer panic was setting in over them like a thick, suffocating blanket, and I intended to let them marinate in that terror for the rest of the night. Susan stared at the manila folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. The tears that had been pooling so convincingly in her eyes vanished with astonishing speed. The dramatic trembling of her lower lip ceased immediately. When emotional manipulation failed, my mother always resorted to righteous indignation. It was a defense mechanism I knew intimately. "You are incredibly bitter." Clara Susan snapped, her voice dropping its fragile tremolo and adopting a harsh, grating edge. "You hold on to these ancient petty grievances just to justify your own cruelty. Richard gave you a life most people only dream of, and you are punishing us because you felt slightly overlooked as a child." "Slightly overlooked," I echoed, letting the words hang in the vast quiet of the penthouse. "Is that how you categorize it in your mind to help you sleep at night?" You stood in the kitchen and watched Richard throw my acceptance letter to Columbia University into the fireplace because he decided the tuition money was better spent on Olivia's second attempt at a fashion startup. A startup that failed within 6 months. You watched my future burn to ashes, and you simply poured yourself another glass of wine. Susan's posture stiffened. "We made difficult financial choices. You were always so independent. We knew you would figure it out. Olivia needed the support. She is delicate. She is a parasite," I corrected smoothly. "And you are an enabler. You allowed Richard to treat me like a second-class citizen in my own home because you were absolutely terrified he would cut off your credit cards if you dared to defend me. You traded my well-being for your comfortable suburban illusion. I was a single mother before I met him." Susan shot back, her face flushing a deep, angry red. "I was working 50 hours a week just to keep the lights on. Richard offered us stability. He gave us a place in society. I made sacrifices so you would not have to grow up in poverty." "You made sacrifices," I said, stepping around the marble island to close the physical distance between us. I towered over her, not just in height, but in absolute authority. "You sacrificed my college fund. You sacrificed my dignity. You sacrificed my bedroom so your stepdaughter could have a closet for her shoe collection. Do not dare stand in my home and claim you did any of that for my benefit. You sold me out for a country club membership and a prestigious zip code." Susan gripped her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked around the immaculate penthouse, her eyes darting across the imported Italian leather furniture, the custom lighting fixtures, and the sweeping skyline view. Her envy was a tangible living thing in the room. "Well, clearly you survived," she hissed, gesturing broadly at the room. "You have all this money now. You have this ridiculous penthouse. You won Clara. So why are you doing this? Why are you purposefully tanking Richard's $12 million deal? We are on the brink of absolute ruin. Jamal called us in a panic last night, saying you threatened to send some sort of fabricated audit to the IRS. You are trying to put your own family in federal prison." "Jamal is a thief and Richard is a fool," I stated flatly. "And I did not fabricate a single document. Your precious son-in-law has been embezzling millions to fund the delicate Olivia's lifestyle." I simply uncovered the truth. As for the property deal, Richard lost his own deposit by being arrogant enough to try and bully a commercial landlord he had not bothered to thoroughly research. "You are the landlord!" Susan cried out, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "You could fix this with one phone call. You could issue a duplicate deed and call off the audit on Jamal. You have the power to save this family." "I do have the power," I agreed, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. "But you are deeply mistaken about one fundamental fact, Susan. You are not my family. Family protects each other. Family does not drain a child's trust fund to pay for a stepdaughter's credit card debt. Family does not force a teenager to sleep in a damp, unfinished basement. You are simply a group of people I used to share a mailing address with. Susan let out a sharp, frustrated breath. She realized that demanding obedience was not going to work. She took a deep breath, attempting to pivot back to a softer maternal approach. She reached out again, trying to place a hand on my arm. I stepped back smoothly, completely out of her reach. "Clara, please," she whispered, softening her tone, attempting to look frail and frightened. "I know we made mistakes. I know I was not always the mother you needed me to be. But Richard is having chest pains over this stress. He could have a heart attack. If the company goes under, we will lose the house. We will lose everything. I am your mother. I am begging you to show a little mercy." Mercy. I repeated the word, tasting foreign and bitter on my tongue. Where was your mercy when I was working 3 jobs in college, barely eating just to pay my tuition? Where was your mercy when Jamal and Olivia stole my commercial zoning proposal 5 years ago, and Richard used it to promote Jamal to vice president, while telling me I was lucky to even have a junior analyst job at the firm? You all sat at the Thanksgiving table and toasted to Jamal's brilliance, while I served the dinner you were too lazy to cook. Susan opened her mouth to argue, but I raised my hand, silencing her instantly. You came up here completely convinced that you could guilt me into submission, because I was always the quiet, obedient daughter, I said, my voice turning to ice. You thought my wealth was a fluke and my spine was still made of glass. But the girl you bullied and discarded died a long time ago. I built an empire while you were busy picking out floral arrangements and ignoring Richard's blatant financial mismanagement. I pointed to the sealed manila folder resting on the marble counter. You asked what I owe Richard, I said. I owe him exactly what he gave me. Nothing. That folder does not contain a duplicate deed. It does not contain a lifeline or a pardon for Jamal's embezzlement. Susan stared at the folder, her eyes widening with a fresh wave of genuine terror. Then what is it? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. It is a formal notice of eviction for Wilson Manufacturing, I said, watching the blood drain completely from her face. Did Richard forget to mention who owns the primary commercial lease on your corporate headquarters? Or did he simply assume his shell companies hid his vulnerabilities perfectly? Susan stared at the formal eviction notice. Her hands shook so violently that the heavy parchment paper rattled against the marble countertop. She tried to push the document away, as if the physical act of distancing herself from the paper would somehow negate the legal reality of the words printed on it. Her breath hitched in her throat. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and wild like a cornered animal searching for any possible exit. When the realization set in that she was entirely trapped, she resorted to the ugliest weapon she had left in her arsenal. The same weapon Richard had tried to use to destroy me publicly at the country club. You are a monster! Susan spat, her voice trembling with venomous rage. Richard was right about you. He knew you were rotten from the very beginning. He stood up in front of all our friends and admitted the darkest secret of our marriage, because he wanted everyone to know exactly what you are. You are not even a Blackwell. You are the product of a cheap affair. Richard took you in. He gave my bastard child his last name. He put a roof over another man's child to save me from public ruin, and you repay his incredible charity by trying to destroy him. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let her vicious words hang in the bright morning light, allowing the absolute toxicity of her statement to fully resonate in the quiet penthouse. She wanted to see me shatter. She wanted the revelation of my paternity to break my spirit just as Richard had hoped it would. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, cold expression that caused the brief flash of triumph on Susan's face to instantly curdle into deep uncertainty. I reached past the eviction notice and opened the second drawer of the kitchen island. I retrieved a thick leather-bound portfolio that I had prepared exactly for this moment. I dropped it heavily onto the marble. The loud thud made Susan jump. I flipped the heavy cover open. Resting on top was a crisp, pristine laboratory document bearing the seal of a highly accredited genetic testing facility. You really believe the paternity announcement at the party was a humiliating blow? I asked, tilting my head slightly. You think Richard dropped a bomb that shattered my identity? All he did was publicly confirm a truth I had already verified independently over 5 years ago. Susan stared at the DNA report, her mouth slightly open. She looked completely lost. But the DNA is only the prologue of this particular tragedy. Susan, I continued, my voice dropping into a razor-sharp cadence. I reached into the portfolio and pulled out a stack of incredibly old yellowed financial ledgers. The paper was brittle and the ink was fading, but the corporate seals stamped on the bottom of the pages were unmistakable. I fanned them out across the counter right next to her trembling hands. Let us talk about my biological father, I said, watching her eyes dart toward the aged paper. Let us talk about Thomas Vance. Susan gasped. The sound was sharp and painful, as if she had suddenly been deprived of oxygen. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching awkwardly on the hardwood floor. She gripped the edge of the island to steady herself. Her face turned a sickly shade of gray. She had clearly convinced herself that this name was permanently buried in the past. How do you know that name? She choked out, her voice barely a harsh whisper. I know everything, Susan, I replied, stepping closer and tapping my finger against the oldest ledger. When I discovered the truth about my DNA, I did not just cry in my room. I hired private investigators. I hired forensic accountants. I dug into the absolute bedrock of Wilson Manufacturing. I dug deep enough to find the original incorporation documents from 30 years ago. The documents Richard tried to illegally expunge from the state archives. I watched her completely unravel as I laid out the exact history she had spent 3 decades trying to pretend never happened. Thomas Vance was not just some random romantic mistake. I stated my words, cutting through the air with surgical precision. He was a brilliant mechanical engineer. He was Richard's original founding partner. Thomas actually designed the core proprietary manufacturing processes that built Richard's entire multi-million-dollar empire. Richard was nothing but the smooth-talking salesman who handled the initial capital. Thomas was the genius who created the product. I was unstable, Susan whispered, shaking her head in a desperate attempt at denial. He was erratic. He surrendered his shares voluntarily. He walked away. I was systematically destroyed, I corrected, my voice rising with cold authority. Richard forged corporate resolutions to dilute Thomas's equity. He locked him out of the patent filings. He leveraged predatory legal tactics to completely oust his own partner, stealing his life's work right out from under him. He drove my real father to absolute financial and emotional ruin. And you stood by and watched him do it. You watched Richard steal Thomas's company, and then you married the thief because you preferred the safety of stolen wealth over basic human decency. Susan covered her mouth with her hand, a stifled sob tearing from her throat. She could not look away from the yellowed ledgers. The undeniable proof of her husband's original sin was laid bare in front of her. You thought Richard taking me in was an act of incredible charity. I continued, relentlessly dismantling her entire worldview. It was not charity, Susan. It was guilt. It was a desperate, calculated attempt to keep his enemies close. He gave me his name because he knew exactly whose blood was running through my veins. He knew I was the sole living heir to the man whose genius he stole. He kept me around to ensure I would never figure out who I really was and what I was actually owed. I gathered the eviction notice and the old ledgers, tapping the edges against the marble to straighten the stack. I am not just holding a $12 million commercial property hostage out of petty revenge. I explained, my tone ringing with absolute finality. I am executing a highly calculated, mathematically precise repossession of stolen generational wealth. The market value of the property I denied him, combined with the penalties of this impending commercial eviction, perfectly equals the current market valuation of the 50% stake Richard illegally stole from Thomas Vance, plus 30 years of compound interest. I slid the thick file back into the leather portfolio. I am systematically liquidating Richard's stolen empire to reclaim exactly what belongs to my real father, I said, looking down at her shrinking, trembling form. Your husband built a castle on stolen ground, Susan, and today I am the landlord coming to collect the rent. You can find your way to the elevator. We have nothing left to discuss. The silence in my penthouse the following morning was profound and absolute. It was the kind of quiet that only immense wealth can buy, high above the endless chaotic noise of the city streets below. I sat at the edge of my massive mahogany dining table, sipping a single cup of black coffee and reviewing the final eviction protocols for Wilson Manufacturing. Susan had clearly rushed back to the suburbs to deliver the apocalyptic news to Richard and Olivia. I fully expected a reaction. I anticipated legal threats, or perhaps a desperate buyout offer. What I received instead was a masterclass in modern digital warfare, orchestrated by a woman who had never worked a hard day in her entire life. It began exactly at 8 in the morning. My personal cell phone resting on the glass surface of the table began to vibrate. It did not just ring once or twice, it erupted into a sustained, continuous tremor. Notifications flooded the screen so rapidly that the display became a solid blur of incoming text messages, missed calls, and social media alerts. I watched the device dance across the glass for a full minute before picking it up. I opened my primary social media application and found my face plastered across the timeline. Olivia had gone on the offensive, denied the $12 million property, and suddenly staring down the barrel of impending poverty. My golden child sister had weaponized the only asset she had left, her follower count. She had crafted a multi-paragraph manifesto accompanied by a carefully selected photograph from 5 years ago. It was a picture of me standing slightly apart from the family at a Thanksgiving dinner, looking exhausted and grim, while Olivia and Richard smiled brightly in the center of the frame. It is with a completely shattered heart that I have to share a private family tragedy. Olivia wrote, her words dripping with manufactured devastation. My sister Clara, who has battled deep-seated jealousy and severe mental instability since childhood, has launched a horrific campaign to extort our elderly father. Richard took her in when she had nothing. He raised her as his own. Now that he is battling heart issues, she has fabricated documents to steal his company and completely bankrupt our family. She is holding his legacy hostage out of pure vindictive spite. Please keep our family in your prayers as we navigate this elder abuse and extortion. I read the post a second time, noting the brilliant manipulation of the narrative. She did not mention the $12 million commercial property. She did not mention Jamal embezzling corporate funds. She certainly did not mention that the company was built on stolen patents belonging to my biological father. She simply painted a picture of a deranged, greedy spinster attacking a benevolent, aging patriarch. The comments were a cesspool of outrage. Thousands of strangers were calling for my immediate arrest, labeling me a monster, a sociopath, and a textbook narcissist. But the strangers did not matter to me. What fascinated me was the immediate and vicious mobilization of the flying monkeys. The extended relatives and family friends who had completely ignored my existence for the past decade were suddenly highly motivated to defend Richard's honor. My voicemail inbox was entirely full. I tapped the first message and put it on speakerphone, letting the sound fill the pristine kitchen. Clara, I cannot even begin to express my absolute disgust. The shrill voice of Aunt Patricia echoed through the room. Patricia had refused to attend my college graduation because Olivia had a minor sinus infection that required her urgent presence. Now she was speaking to me with righteous fury. How dare you do this to the man who put clothes on your back? You always were a bitter, ungrateful little girl. To attack an old man with a heart condition for money. You are completely dead to this family. I deleted the message without a change in expression and played the next one. It was Cousin Gregory, a man who had borrowed $5,000 from Richard to start a failed landscaping business. You are a sociopath, Clara, he shouted into the receiver. Richard is a saint. He gave you his name. I am driving down to your office today to tell your partners exactly what kind of extortionists they are working with. You are going to end up in a jail cell. Message after message played out in the quiet room. A chorus of people who had never once asked me how I was paying my rent during my 20s. People who had sat at dinner tables and laughed while Richard mocked my career ambitions. People who had eagerly accepted Richard's lavish gifts, bought with stolen money, and were now absolutely terrified that the gravy train was about to derail. They were not defending Richard out of love. They were defending the bankroll. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the bitter liquid ground me. My assistant texted me moments later asking if we should issue an immediate cease and desist or draft a public relations counterstatement. I typed back a single word. No. I absolutely refuse to engage in an online mudslinging contest. Social media is a court of public opinion where the loudest victim always wins. I operated in a much higher court, I dealt in legal contracts, binding financial agreements, and federal tax codes. I knew exactly why Olivia had launched this digital witch hunt. She was panicked. Susan had told them about the DNA report and the original 30-year-old ledgers. They knew their legal standing was non-existent, so they were trying to apply immense social pressure, hoping I would crack under the weight of public humiliation and back down. They fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. A new notification popped up. Olivia had just started a live video broadcast. I clicked the link, watching her face appear on my screen. She was sitting on her pristine white velvet sofa. She was wearing a $4,000 cashmere cardigan and a pair of diamond stud earrings. I recognized the earrings instantly. Jamal had purchased them 3 months ago and written them off as a corporate vendor expense in the company ledgers. Olivia was crying. Real tears tracked down her perfectly contoured cheeks. "It is not just my father," she wept, addressing her thousands of viewers. "Clara is going after my husband Jamal. Jamal is the hardest working man I know. He built the logistics department from nothing. Clara is threatening to send fabricated tax documents to the authorities to frame Jamal for embezzlement, just to force my father to sign over his remaining assets. It is pure evil. We are terrified of what she might do next." I watched her wipe her eyes with the sleeve of her stolen cashmere. She was playing the role of the besieged princess perfectly. She assumed that by getting out ahead of the embezzlement charges and publicly labeling my evidence as fabricated, she could control the damage when the authorities actually knocked on her door. She thought she was being brilliant. She was actually providing me with video evidence of defamation. My phone rang again. This time it was an unlisted number. I let it ring out, but a text message followed immediately. It was from Martin, an old golf buddy of Richard's, who sat on the board of several prominent local charities. "I saw Olivia's post," Martin wrote. "I am forwarding it to the Ethics Committee of your Commercial Real Estate Association. You cannot conduct business in this city while extorting a respected elder statesman like Richard. Back down now, Clara, or we will make sure you never close another deal in this state." I set the phone down on the marble island. They truly believed they could intimidate me by threatening my professional reputation. They thought this coordinated barrage of hatred and isolation would break me, because it had worked so perfectly when I was 16. When I was a teenager, the threat of being outcast from the family was terrifying. Now at 32, the reality of being outcast from them was the greatest gift I had ever received. I did not owe these people a single syllable of explanation. I did not need to defend my actions to an aunt who thought I was worthless, or a cousin who lived off handouts. I would not interrupt my enemies while they were making a catastrophic mistake. Every vicious lie Olivia posted, every defamatory voicemail the Flying Monkeys left, and every written threat from Richard's Old Boys Club was simply more ammunition for my legal team. I stood up from the table, picking up the thick leather portfolio containing the unredacted audit, the eviction notice, and the genetic testing results. The digital witch hunt was a pathetic distraction. It was time to shift the battlefield away from the internet and into the real world. I walked toward my private elevator, ready to deliver the final killing blow to Wilson Manufacturing. The doors of my private elevator slid open, revealing the hushed, purposeful atmosphere of my corporate office. The sleek glass walls and minimal aesthetic stood in stark contrast to the messy, emotional chaos my family was currently broadcasting across the internet. I walked directly to my desk, taking a seat in my leather chair and opening my laptop. The digital witch hunt Olivia had initiated was still raging online, but I had absolutely no interest in fighting a battle of public opinion. I did not care about the hateful voicemails from extended relatives or the fabricated outrage from mutual acquaintances. They were entirely irrelevant. I was focused solely on dismantling the financial infrastructure that allowed my golden child sister to live in her delusional bubble. I pulled up the forensic audit files I had secured from Jamal's sloppy accounting department. The data was crystal clear and meticulously organized. Richard's holding company funded a massive corporate credit account, theoretically reserved for senior executive travel and operational expenses. Jamal had illegally authorized a platinum secondary card for Olivia, linking her insatiable personal spending habits directly to the company's bleeding cash reserves. She was using a corporate lifeline to buy luxury handbags and fund elite spa retreats, while the manufacturing firm was actively hemorrhaging money from the forfeited $12 million commercial deposit. Every single swipe of her card was another documented instance of corporate fraud. I pressed the intercom button on my desk and instructed my lead corporate attorney to initiate the protocol we had prepared. We securely transmitted the unredacted financial ledgers and the documented proof of Jamal's embezzlement directly to the Fraud and Compliance Division of Richard's primary banking institution. The banking sector operates under extremely strict federal regulations regarding money laundering and commingled corporate funds. When presented with undeniable forensic evidence of severe financial misconduct, the bank had absolutely no choice. They were legally obligated to protect their own institutional liability against federal scrutiny. I watched the screen of my computer, tracking the real-time status of the corporate accounts through the legal portal my attorneys had established. It took exactly 47 minutes for the bank's automated compliance system to trigger the emergency alert. A solid red banner appeared across the digital dashboard, confirming that all corporate credit lines associated with Wilson Manufacturing were officially frozen. The accounts were completely locked down. The endless stream of stolen money was permanently severed. I leaned back in my chair, interlacing my fingers, and waited. I knew Olivia's psychological habits intimately. Whenever she felt stressed or threatened, her immediate coping mechanism was extravagant retail therapy. She had spent the entire morning performing a tragic victim routine for her social media followers, crying on camera and painting me as a deranged extortionist. It was practically guaranteed that she would reward her own exhausting performance with a lavish shopping spree on the company dime. She needed the validation of luxury to soothe her frayed nerves. The profound silence in my office was broken by the sharp buzzing of my personal cell phone resting on the mahogany desk. I glanced at the glowing screen. Olivia's name flashed urgently. I let it ring 4 times, savoring the rising panic I knew she was experiencing with each unanswered tone. I imagined her standing there clutching her phone, willing me to pick up. Finally, I reached out and tapped the screen, accepting the call. "Clara, you need to fix this right now!" Olivia shrieked the moment the connection opened. Her voice was not the delicate, sorrowful whisper she had used on her video broadcast just hours prior. It was a raw, frantic screech that echoed loudly through the speaker of my phone. She was breathing heavily, and I could hear the distinct ambient noise of a high-end retail environment in the background. The soft elevator music and the hushed murmurs of sales associates were entirely drowned out by her absolute hysteria. "Fix what, Olivia?" I asked, my tone mild and perfectly detached. "My cards are declining!" she screamed, the panic tearing at the edges of her voice, making her sound breathless and wild. "I am standing at the register at the designer boutique. I have 3 bags and a cashmere coat, and the machine keeps saying contact the issuing institution. The manager is looking at me like I am some kind of common criminal. They are whispering about me, Clara. I know they are whispering. You did this. I know you did this. You called the bank and told them some horrible lie. You need to call them back and authorize the transaction immediately before this gets worse." I smiled, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office at the sprawling city below. I could picture the scene with perfect clarity. Olivia standing at a polished glass counter, her face flushed red with absolute mortification, while impeccably dressed sales associates exchanged knowing glances behind her back. The golden child was finally experiencing the crushing weight of real public humiliation, and she had absolutely no idea how to handle it. "I did not tell the bank a single lie," I replied smoothly, leaning closer to the phone so she could hear every syllable clearly. "I simply provided their fraud department with the exact same forensic audit I showed your husband last night. The bank realized that your platinum card is tied to an account Jamal has been using to embezzle corporate funds. They froze the lines to prevent further criminal activity. You are trying to buy designer coats with stolen money, Olivia. The bank tends to frown on that sort of behavior." "You are lying!" she sobbed, her voice cracking as the reality of the situation began to penetrate her thick shell of lifelong entitlement. "We own that company. It is our money. You are just jealous. You have always been jealous of me because Richard loved me more and gave me everything I wanted. You are doing this to ruin my life because you are a sad, bitter woman who cannot stand seeing anyone else happy." I listened to her frantic insults, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, profound sense of closure. She was grasping at invisible straws, trying to use the same petty childhood insults that used to make me cry in my bedroom when we were teenagers. But those words had zero power over me anymore. They were just empty, desperate sounds, made by a woman who suddenly realized she had no marketable skills, no actual wealth, and no access to the trust fund she had drained dry. I want you to take a deep breath and look around that boutique. Olivia, I said, my voice dropping to a low conversational volume that demanded absolute attention. Look at the bags you cannot afford. Look at the manager who is waiting for you to leave so they can put the merchandise back on the shelves. I want you to feel this exact moment of helplessness. Consider this the real-world version of when you cut up my prom dress because you did not like the color. Actions have consequences, Olivia. Clara, please, she begged, the anger vanishing, instantly replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. You cannot leave me here like this. I cannot walk out of this store empty-handed after making such a scene. They will talk about me. Everyone in my circle will know my cards bounced. Please just unlock it for 1 hour. I will pay you back. I promise I will pay you back. You have nothing left to pay me with. I said, the finality of the statement ringing crystal clear in the quiet office. And your consequences are just beginning. I tapped the screen and ended the call, severing the connection before she could utter another pathetic, pleading word. I placed the phone face down on the desk and let the profound quiet wash over me again. The corporate accounts were entirely frozen. The $12 million property was secured. The original patents belonging to my biological father were officially in the process of being reclaimed. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small and insignificant. They had stolen my resources and mocked my ambitions at every turn. But the game they had rigged in their favor was officially over. I had systematically dismantled their empire piece by piece, and I had done it without raising my voice or shedding a single tear. I opened my laptop and began drafting the next phase of the corporate takeover, knowing the true victory was already mine. I closed the window displaying Olivia's social media accounts and immediately opened the master file for Vanguard Holdings. The digital infrastructure of Richard's company was rapidly bleeding out, but the physical heart of his empire still remained operational. It was time to stop the machines. I pulled up the master commercial lease agreement between my holding firm and Wilson Manufacturing. It was a standard ironclad document drafted by the best real estate attorneys in the city, the very same attorneys Richard thought he was outsmarting when he signed it through a labyrinth of blind trusts. He had been so focused on hiding his own assets that he never bothered to investigate the actual owner of the $12 million industrial complex. He desperately needed to expand his operations. I scrolled down to Section 14, Subsection C, the Morality and Legal Compliance Clause. It stipulated the immediate termination of the lease and a mandatory 30-day eviction if the tenant or any of its executive officers were found to be conducting fraudulent financial activity, embezzlement, or felony crimes on the premises. Jamal had practically handed me the key to the kingdom. By using the corporate accounts routed through the manufacturing plant's address to hide his theft and fund Olivia's exorbitant lifestyle, he had triggered a catastrophic breach of contract. I printed the formal notice to vacate on thick watermarked legal paper. I signed my name with slow, deliberate strokes. A standard landlord would send this via certified mail or dispatch a process server. But this was not a standard real estate transaction. This was an execution. I summoned Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, and two of my personal security contractors. We descended to the underground garage where my driver was waiting. The ride to the industrial district was remarkably quiet. I watched the city skyline transition into the sprawling grid of warehouses and manufacturing plants. When we pulled up to the main gates of Wilson Manufacturing, the nostalgia hit me for a fraction of a second before I crushed it. I had spent countless afternoons in this exact building as a teenager, waiting in the lobby for hours, while Richard held court in his corner office. He used to make me wait just to prove he could. He used to walk past me without a glance, demonstrating his absolute power. Today the power dynamic was permanently inverted. I walked through the double-glass doors with Marcus and the security team flanking me. The receptionist at the front desk stood up abruptly, her eyes wide as she registered the imposing group. She opened her mouth to ask for an appointment, but I walked straight past her desk without breaking my stride. We moved through the corridors with singular purpose. The hum of the assembly lines and the heavy rhythmic thud of the stamping machines vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of Richard's stolen empire functioning at full capacity. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to the executive suite without knocking. The scene inside was pure chaotic desperation. Richard stood behind his massive desk, his face purple with rage, shouting violently into his desk phone. Jamal was slumped in a leather guest chair, sweating profusely and clutching a stack of printed bank statements. They were clearly in the middle of discovering the frozen corporate accounts. Richard slammed the phone down into its cradle as I entered the room. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his eyes darting from my face to the two massive security guards standing by the door. "What in the hell do you think you are doing, Clara?" he bellowed, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched collar. "You march into my office with hired muscle, I will have you arrested for trespassing. Get out of my building before I call the police." I walked directly to his desk. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply dropped the heavy watermarked envelope onto the center of his pristine leather blotter. "It is not your building, Richard," I stated, my voice carrying a lethal calm that instantly silenced the room. "You are a tenant. And as of this morning, you are a tenant in severe breach of your lease agreement." Richard scoffed, a harsh barking sound of pure disbelief. He ripped open the envelope and pulled out the legal document. His eyes scanned the bold print at the top of the page. "Formal notice of eviction. 30 days to vacate." "You are out of your mind," he spat, throwing the paper back onto the desk. "You think you can buy the property out from under me and just kick me out? I have a 10-year ironclad lease. I have teams of lawyers who will tie you up in court for a decade. You cannot touch me, Clara." Marcus stepped forward calmly, placing a second folder on the desk. "Section 14, subsection C of your lease agreement," Marcus said, his professional tone cutting through Richard's bluster. "Immediate termination upon discovery of corporate fraud or embezzlement conducted by executive officers. We have already submitted the unredacted financial ledgers to the federal authorities and your primary banking institution. Vice President Jamal here has been systematically siphoning millions of dollars from your operating budget using the corporate address to mask the wire transfers. The lease is entirely void." Richard froze. He slowly turned his head to look at Jamal. The younger man shrank back into his chair, his face draining of all color. Jamal opened his mouth to formulate a defense, but only a pathetic squeaking sound emerged. "You have exactly 30 days to remove every single piece of machinery, every desk, every file cabinet, and every scrap of inventory from my property," I said, leaning over the desk and forcing Richard to meet my eyes. "If you fail to vacate the premises entirely by the stroke of midnight on the 30th day, the property and everything left inside it legally reverts to the landlord. I will scrap your life's work for pennies." "You cannot do this to me," Richard whispered, the aggressive red flush leaving his face replaced by a sickly pale hue. "It takes 6 months and $10 million in capital to relocate a manufacturing hub of this size. We cannot move the stamping machines in 30 days. It is a physical impossibility. You are issuing a death sentence to this company." "I am issuing a consequence," I replied smoothly. Richard's hands began to shake. He looked down at the eviction notice and then back up at me. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was finally fracturing. "Clara, please," he said, his voice cracking, adopting the same pathetic begging tone Susan had used in my penthouse. "After everything I did for you, I put a roof over your head. I gave you my name. I raised you as my own daughter. You owe me your life." "I owe you nothing," I said, my words striking him like physical blows. "You stole my life. You stole my real father's life." Richard flinched violently, stepping back from the desk, as if he had been burned. "I know exactly what you did to Thomas Vance," I said, watching the absolute terror completely consume him. "I know you forged the resolutions. I know you stole the patents. I know you drove the real genius behind this company to his grave so you could play the wealthy patriarch. You built this entire empire on the bones of a better man." I turned my back on him. I signaled to Marcus and the security team. "You have 30 days, Richard," I called out over my shoulder as I walked toward the door. "I suggest you stop shouting at your embezzling son-in-law and start packing boxes." I walked out of the executive suite, leaving the doors wide open behind me. Before I even reached the elevator, the sound of Richard screaming at Jamal echoed down the long corridor, followed by the violent crash of heavy objects being thrown across the office. I stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the ground floor. The satisfying hum of the machinery resonated around me, a mechanical symphony playing the final notes of Richard's ruin. Exactly 72 hours had passed since I left Richard standing in his office, surrounded by the impending wreckage of his stolen manufacturing empire. I knew he would not simply pack his boxes and concede defeat. He possessed the arrogant delusion of a man who had spent 3 decades believing his own fabricated mythology. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals always resort to their most familiar instincts. For Richard, that meant relying on the antiquated old boys network he believed still ran the world. I was seated at the head of the expansive glass-walled boardroom on the 40th floor of Vanguard Holdings. The morning sun poured over the polished mahogany table where my 4 senior managing partners were reviewing our quarterly acquisition targets. These were brilliant, seasoned financial veterans in their late 50s and 60s. They were men who commanded immense respect in the corporate sector, but they answered directly to me. The heavy double doors of the boardroom suddenly burst open with a violent shove. My executive assistant stumbled backward, her face pale with alarm as she tried to block the entrance. "I am so sorry, Miss Blackwell," she stammered breathlessly. He forced his way past security in the lobby. He claimed he had a federal injunction. I raised a single hand, silencing my assistant and signaling my private security team to stand down. I wanted to see exactly how Richard planned to play this hand. Richard stormed into the room. He was wearing his most expensive bespoke charcoal suit, but the illusion of power was severely compromised by the frantic sheen of sweat on his forehead and the desperate, wild look in his eyes. He marched straight past me, entirely ignoring my presence at the head of the table. He moved directly toward Arthur and David, 2 of my oldest and most traditional-looking senior partners. He completely bypassed me, viewing me as nothing more than a rogue subordinate who needed to be disciplined by the adults in the room. "Gentlemen, I sincerely apologize for this unprecedented interruption," Richard announced, projecting his voice with the booming manufactured authority he usually reserved for country club dinners. "I am Richard Blackwell, the CEO of Wilson Manufacturing. I used to play golf with your founding partner William Vanguard back in the 90s. I am calling in a massive favor today because your firm is currently harboring a deeply disturbed and dangerously insubordinate employee." Arthur slowly took off his reading glasses and placed them on the table. He looked at Richard with an expression of mild anthropological fascination, but remained completely silent. Richard took this silence as an invitation to continue. He placed his hands flat on the mahogany table, leaning forward to create a conspiratorial bond with the older men. "The young woman sitting at the end of your table is my estranged adoptive daughter," Richard said, his tone dripping with a sickening blend of fake paternal sorrow and corporate condescension. "She is currently experiencing a severe mental health crisis. She has allowed deeply rooted family jealousies to completely cloud her professional judgment. 3 days ago, she went rogue. She utilized Vanguard Holdings resources to illegally freeze my corporate credit accounts, and she issued a fraudulent eviction notice against my primary manufacturing plant. She is attempting to use your prestigious firm to execute a petty personal vendetta." Richard reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the eviction notice I had served him. He tossed it onto the center of the boardroom table like a trump card. "I am a respected fixture in this city's industrial sector," Richard continued, his voice rising with righteous indignation. "I employ hundreds of people. I will not have my life's work jeopardized by an emotional, hysterical junior executive who lacks basic business ethics. I demand that you void this eviction notice immediately. Furthermore, for the legal protection of your own firm, I strongly advise that you terminate her employment today before she exposes Vanguard Holdings to massive defamation lawsuits." The boardroom remained utterly silent. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background. My 4 senior partners did not look at the eviction notice. They did not look at Richard. In perfect unison, they all slowly turned their heads and looked directly at me, awaiting my instruction. Richard followed their gaze. For the first time since he breached the boardroom, he actually looked at me. His chest was heaving with exertion. He expected to see me shrinking in my chair, terrified that I had been exposed to my superiors. He expected to see me packing my briefcase in disgrace. Instead, I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. I set the glass down, ensuring it rested perfectly on the coaster. "Are you quite finished, Richard?" I asked, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute detachment that caused his confident posture to falter. "I am waiting for your superiors to handle this, Clara," he snapped, pointing a shaking finger at Arthur. "You are finished. Your little power trip is over. You do not own the ground you walk on." "You have made two catastrophic miscalculations today, Richard," I said, standing up from my leather chair. I slowly buttoned my tailored suit jacket and began to walk down the length of the long table toward him. "First, you assumed that the world still operates like a 1990s country club, where a loud voice and a tailored suit can bully people into submission. Second, you assumed that I am an employee." I stopped just 2 feet away from him. I could smell the sharp tang of his nervous sweat mixed with expensive cologne. "William Vanguard retired 5 years ago." I explained, my words striking him with surgical precision. "When he retired, he sold his controlling interest in this firm. I did not just climb the corporate ladder, Richard. I bought the ladder. I am the majority shareholder. I am the managing director. I own Vanguard Holdings. These gentlemen do not employ me. I employ them." The blood drained from Richard's face so rapidly that his skin took on a sickly grayish hue. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching the faces of the older men for any sign that I was lying. Arthur simply raised an eyebrow and gave a single slow nod, confirming my absolute authority. "You walked into my fortress," Richard the continued, relentlessly dismantling his final remaining illusion of power. "You bypassed my security to demand that my employees fire me from the company that I own. The eviction notice is not a rogue action. It is a fully authorized, legally binding corporate mandate issued by the owner of the property. You are trespassing on my land, and you are currently trespassing in my boardroom." "This is impossible," Richard whispered, stumbling backward a few steps until his back hit the glass wall. "You cannot be in charge. You are just Clara. I am the daughter of Thomas Vance." I corrected, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "I am the heir to the genius you stole. You spent 30 years trying to convince me that I was a worthless charity case, so I would never look closely at the empire you built on my father's back. But I looked, Richard. I looked at the ledgers. I looked at the patents. And I looked at Jamal's sloppy embezzlement scheme, which gave me the exact legal leverage I needed to terminate your commercial lease permanently." I reached out and picked up the crumpled eviction notice from the table. I smoothed out the creases and handed it back to him. He took it with trembling hands. "There will be no negotiations," I stated with absolute finality. "There will be no extensions. You have exactly 27 days left to vacate my property. If you leave a single machine or a single paperclip in that building on day 30, I will seize it all and sell it for scrap. You thought you could come here and charm a room full of men into saving you. But the old world is dead, Richard. And I am the one holding the shovel." I turned back to my security team, who had been standing silently by the door. "Escort Mr. Blackwell out of the building," I commanded without looking back at him. "If he resists, or if he ever attempts to enter this building again, have him arrested for trespassing." I walked back to the head of the table and took my seat. I did not watch as the two massive security guards took Richard by the arms and physically marched him out of the boardroom. I only heard his rapid, panicked breathing and the heavy thud of the doors sealing shut behind him. I looked at my senior partners, who were already opening their financial dossiers, ready to resume the meeting as if nothing had happened. The absolute silence returned to the room. The eviction was final, and Richard was completely out of time. The glass elevators of Apex Capital Holdings moved silently upward, carrying Richard into the stratosphere of the city's financial district. I watched his arrival on the security monitors from the comfort of my private office. He stepped out onto the executive floor looking exactly as I expected. He wore his finest tailored suit, his posture rigid with a manufactured authority that had worked for him for decades. He was a man who genuinely believed that any problem could be solved by walking into a room full of wealthy men, shaking a few hands and calling in old favors. He thought he was about to outsmart a rogue employee. He had no idea he was walking into a mausoleum prepared specifically for his ego. Richard was immediately greeted by Ethan, my most trusted business partner, and the public face of the firm. Ethan was brilliant, ruthless, and possessed a natural charm that disarmed even the most guarded executives. I watched on the feed as Ethan extended a warm handshake, ushering Richard down the pristine corridor and into the grand boardroom. The boardroom was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the skyline, while a massive polished mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Ethan directed Richard to a seat near the middle, pouring him a glass of sparkling water and taking a seat opposite him. I listened to the audio feed as Richard immediately launched into his prepared narrative. He spoke with the deep, resonant tone of an aggrieved patriarch. He told Ethan that our firm had a massive liability on its hands. He spun a tragic tale about an estranged, emotionally unstable daughter who had somehow manipulated her way into a mid-level position at Apex Capital. He claimed that I was using company resources to execute an illegal personal vendetta against his manufacturing plant, and that my actions were exposing the firm to millions of dollars in defamation lawsuits. Ethan played his part flawlessly. He nodded sympathetically, taking meticulous notes on a legal pad. He validated Richard's concerns, murmuring agreements about the importance of maintaining strict corporate ethics and the dangers of allowing personal emotions to interfere with business operations. Richard relaxed, visibly leaning back in his leather chair. He actually smiled. He believed he had won. He believed he had successfully charmed the sensible male leadership into neutralizing the hysterical female problem. "I assure you, Richard, we take these allegations with the utmost seriousness," Ethan said, his voice projecting absolute professional sincerity. "Unauthorized interference with a respected corporate entity like Wilson Manufacturing is not something we tolerate. I have called for an emergency review. In fact, the controlling majority partner of the firm has decided to handle this matter personally. She will be joining us right now." Richard nodded approvingly, adjusting his tie and sitting up straighter. He was ready to charm the boss. He was ready to watch me get fired. I pushed open the heavy oak double doors of the boardroom and stepped inside. The rhythmic clicking of my heels against the hardwood floor was the only sound in the vast room. I did not look at Richard immediately. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, walking with deliberate, measured steps past the empty leather chairs. I moved directly to the absolute head of the long mahogany table. I pulled out the high-backed chair reserved strictly for the managing director and sat down. I rested my forearms on the polished wood, and finally turned my eyes to the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. Richard's brain simply could not process the visual information he was receiving. His jaw went slack. He looked from me to Ethan and then back to me. He half rose from his chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if trying to ground himself in reality. "What is this?" Richard stammered, the confident baritone entirely absent from his voice. "What are you doing in that chair, Clara? Get up immediately before you humiliate yourself further." "Ethan, I demand to speak to the senior partner. I will not sit here and be mocked by a disobedient little girl throwing a temper tantrum." Ethan did not move. He simply folded his hands and looked at Richard with a cold, impassive stare. I smiled coldly, letting the absolute silence of the room amplify his panic before I spoke. "I stopped being a little girl the day you told me a woman's only worth was marrying a rich man." I said, my words slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. "I took your advice. I married my ambition, and it made me infinitely richer than you." Richard stumbled backward, his knees hitting his chair. He fell back into the leather seat, his breathing sudden and shallow. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him looking old and devastatingly fragile. "You cannot be the majority partner," he whispered, shaking his head in frantic denial. "This firm manages billions. You are just Clara. You do not know anything about private equity. You do not have this kind of capital." "I have exactly the kind of capital required to buy the commercial real estate beneath your failing manufacturing plant," I corrected, leaning forward slightly. I have the capital required to purchase the corporate debt your embezzling son-in-law created. I did not sneak into this firm, Richard. I built it. Ethan does not supervise me. I employ him. And right now you are sitting in my boardroom, demanding that my subordinate fire me for executing a perfectly legal eviction notice against a tenant who is in severe breach of contract. I watched the realization hit him like a physical blow. The walls of his carefully constructed reality were collapsing inward. He had spent 30 years controlling the narrative dictating who had power and who was worthless. He had truly believed that because I did not fight him loudly at the dinner table, I was simply accepting defeat. He never realized that my silence was not submission, it was strategy. You set me up, Richard choked out, pointing a trembling finger at me. You orchestrated all of this. You waited until we needed to expand, and then you bought the property through a blind trust just to trap me. You froze Olivia's accounts. You are trying to destroy my family. I am simply applying the exact same business principles you taught me. I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. You taught me that leverage is everything. You taught me that mercy has no place in a boardroom. When you stole my biological father's patents and pushed him out of his own company, you called it a smart business acquisition. When you gave me your last name just to ensure I would never go digging into the archives, you called it family loyalty. I am just a very good student, Richard. I found your leverage and I applied pressure. He looked wildly at Ethan, searching for any lifeline, any crack in the unified front. You cannot let her do this, Richard pleaded, abandoning all pretense of authority. She is acting out of pure spite. My company employs hundreds of people. We have municipal contracts. If she kicks us out in 30 days, we will default on everything. The company will go bankrupt. We will lose everything. Ethan remained completely stoic. As the controlling partner, her decisions regarding property management are final, Ethan stated smoothly. Apex Capital Holdings fully supports the eviction based on the documented financial fraud originating from your operational hub. There is no appeal process available to you within this firm. I stood up from the head of the table, smoothing the front of my jacket. I looked down at the man who had once terrified me with a single disappointed glare. Now he was just a desperate aging fraud begging for a reprieve he had never once offered anyone else. Your 30-day countdown began the moment I served you the notice, I said, looking directly into his panicked eyes. You have wasted 3 of those days throwing tantrums on the internet and running to my office to complain to my employees. I highly suggest you spend the remaining 27 days securing moving trucks. If your machinery is not off my property by the deadline, I will seize it and liquidate it to cover your outstanding corporate debts. I gestured to the heavy oak doors. You know the way out, Richard, and do not ever attempt to bypass my security again. The next time you enter my building uninvited, you will leave in handcuffs. The 2 massive security guards had their hands firmly clamped around Richard's upper arms. They were halfway to the heavy oak doors when his survival instinct finally overrode his stunned paralysis. He dug his expensive leather heels into the thick boardroom carpet, resisting their forward momentum with every ounce of his remaining strength. Wait, Clara, wait! Richard gasped, his breath ragged and uneven. I raised a single hand. The security guards stopped instantly, releasing their grip and stepping back exactly 1 pace. They stood like statues, waiting for my next command. Richard violently shrugged his shoulders, adjusting his ruined suit jacket. He took a deep breath, attempting to summon the ghosts of his former authority. He smoothed his silver hair and turned back to face me. In his mind, he had just identified my true motivation. He believed that because I operated in the world of private equity, my ultimate objective was simply capital. He assumed that every person had a price, and he was thoroughly convinced he could afford mine. I will buy it, Richard said, his voice gaining a fraction of its normal resonance. I will buy the commercial property outright. You want a return on your investment, I understand that. It is just business. Name your premium. I will authorize a cash buyout for the entire $12 million valuation, plus a 20% penalty for the inconvenience. He stepped back toward the mahogany table, pulling a platinum pen from his breast pocket. He was genuinely trying to initiate a high-stakes financial negotiation in the middle of his own eviction. 20% is a very generous margin, Clara. He continued trying to establish a rapport with the senior partners who were still watching him with mild disgust. You can take that capital and roll it into a new acquisition by Friday. We execute the transfer today, and we tear up the eviction notice. Everyone walks away wealthy. I looked at him with a profound sense of pity. He was standing on the precipice of absolute destruction, and he still thought he was the smartest man in the room. I agree to a buyout, I said, my voice perfectly level. Richard smiled. It was a greasy, triumphant expression. He glanced at Ethan as if to say he knew exactly how to handle women like me. He reached for his checkbook. But the price is not cash. Richard, I continued. Cash is entirely useless to me. I already have more of it than you will ever see in your lifetime. I reached beneath the table and retrieved a pristine white leather folder. I placed it squarely in front of my seat and flipped the cover open. Inside rested a stack of legally drafted affidavits printed on thick archival paper. I slid the entire stack across the polished mahogany. The documents glided silently, coming to a rest exactly 2 inches from his fingertips. Richard stared at the papers. His triumphant smile slowly vanished. If you want to save your manufacturing plant from immediate liquidation, you will sign those documents. Documents, I instructed, my tone entirely devoid of negotiation. The first page is a sworn confession detailing your direct knowledge and active cover-up of Jamal's corporate embezzlement. You will admit that you allowed him to bleed the company dry to protect your daughter's lifestyle. Richard stared at the paper as if it were coated in poison. The second document is a sworn affidavit addressed to the Federal Patent Office and the State Corporate Registry, I continued relentlessly. In it, you will publicly confess to forging the corporate resolutions that diluted Thomas Vance's equity. You will admit to stealing the proprietary designs that built your empire. You will sign a legally binding statement, acknowledging that every dollar you have generated for the past 30 years was stolen from my biological father. You are insane! Richard whispered, his hands shaking so violently he dropped his platinum pen. It clattered loudly against the table. I will go to federal prison. I will be ruined. The third document, I said, ignoring his panic entirely, is the total transfer of all your remaining shares in Wilson Manufacturing directly to me. You will sign over the remainder of your failing company. You will step down as CEO effectively immediately. You will walk out of this building with exactly what you brought into my life: nothing. The boardroom was dead silent. The magnitude of the ultimatum hung in the air. I was not offering him a business deal. I was offering him a choice between financial annihilation and complete public disgrace. I will never sign this! Richard snarled, his voice rising to a frantic shout. You want me to destroy my own legacy. You want me to admit I am a fraud in front of the entire industrial sector. I would rather see the company burn to the ground than hand you the matches. I will liquidate my personal assets. I will hire a battalion of defense attorneys. I will drag you through the appellate courts until you are utterly bankrupt. I looked at him with an expression of pure icy calm. You do not have any personal assets left to liquidate, Richard said, but by all means go home and check your accounts. I gestured to the security team. Get him out of my sight. The guards did not give him a chance to resist a second time. They grabbed him by the shoulders and physically propelled him out of the boardroom. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing the space in perfect tranquility. I gathered the unsigned confessions and placed them neatly back into the white folder. The trap was fully set, and Richard was currently racing home to spring it on himself. Later that evening, I sat in the sprawling living room of my penthouse. The city lights sparkled through the glass, illuminating the dark hardwood floors. A single glass of vintage red wine rested on the side table next to my personal cell phone. I was reviewing the preliminary blueprints for the rebranding of Wilson Manufacturing when the screen of my phone suddenly illuminated. The caller ID displayed Susan's name. I did not answer. I simply watched the phone vibrate against the dark wood. I knew exactly what was happening miles away in their pristine suburban mansion. The phone stopped ringing. A moment later, a notification appeared on my screen. I had received a new voicemail. The audio file was 14 minutes long. I picked up the phone, tapped the screen, and connected the audio to the high-definition surround sound speakers in my living room. I sat back in my velvet chair, took a slow sip of my wine, and listened to the glorious implosion of the family that had tried to destroy me. The recording did not begin with a greeting. It began with the unmistakable sound of a heavy vase shattering against a hardwood floor, followed by the muffled, frantic rustling of a phone being dropped into a pocket. Susan had clearly pocket-dialed me in a state of absolute terror. The audio quality was pristine. The grand acoustics of Richard's sweeping foyer captured every single echoing shout. "Get your bags packed right now!" Richard's voice roared through my speakers. It was not his corporate baritone. It was the feral, desperate scream of a hunted animal. "We are liquidating the personal accounts. We are putting the estate on the market tomorrow morning. Call the broker Susan. We need cash immediately. Richard, please calm down." Susan's voice trembled, hovering near the microphone of her hidden phone. "What happened at the meeting? Did she accept the buyout?" "She is trying to destroy me," Richard bellowed. The sound of heavy footsteps stomping across the marble floor echoed loudly. "She wants me to confess to fraud. I need to move the private equity funds to the offshore accounts before she files a secondary injunction. Bring me my laptop." There was a tense silence on the recording, filled only with the sound of rapid typing and harsh, heavy breathing. Then a sound emerged that I will remember for the rest of my life. It was a guttural, choking gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice suddenly tiny and fragile. "What is this lien? Why is the bank showing a zero balance on the equity line? Richard, what is wrong?" Susan asked, her panic escalating. At that moment, the heavy front door of the mansion must have opened, because Olivia's shrill voice suddenly joined the chaotic symphony. She and Jamal had arrived. "Daddy, you have to do something!" Olivia shrieked, the sound of her expensive heels clicking rapidly across the marble. "My cards are entirely frozen. Jamal's accounts are locked. The bank is refusing to speak with us." "Jamal, step into my office right now," Richard commanded. His voice was no longer panicked. It was deadly cold. "Richard, I can explain." Jamal stammered, his voice shaking so badly he sounded like a frightened child. "The market shifted. The logistics contracts were delayed. I just needed to borrow against the equity temporarily to cover the margin calls. I was going to put it back." "You used my house!" Richard roared, the sound of a heavy oak desk being flipped over, crashing violently through the speakers. "You forged my signature and leveraged my personal estate to cover your embezzlement. You did not just steal from the company. You stole my home. You bankrupted me." The audio descended into pure physical violence. There was the sickening sound of a fist connecting with bone, followed by Jamal crying out in pain. Glass shattered. A heavy lamp hit the floor. "Stop it!" Olivia screamed, her voice tearing at the highest possible pitch. "Daddy, stop hitting him! He is a thief!" Richard screamed, completely losing his mind. "He lost the company. He lost the house. We have nothing left. We are entirely destitute because you married a parasite." "It is not my fault," Olivia shrieked, pivoting her rage with terrifying speed. She turned her vicious entitlement toward the only target left in the room. "This is your fault, Mother." "Me?" Susan gasped, sounding genuinely stunned. "You brought that bastard child into this house!" Olivia screamed, directing decades of spoiled rage at her own mother. "You should have left Clara at an orphanage. You forced Dad to take her in, and now she is ruining our lives. If you had just gotten rid of her when she was born, none of this would be happening. We are going to be homeless because of your disgusting mistake." The room fell silent except for Jamal's pathetic whimpering. Then Susan snapped. 30 years of maintaining a polite fiction. 30 years of pretending to be the perfect suburban wife utterly vanished. When she spoke, her voice was a terrifying guttural hiss that cut through the room like a serrated blade. "Do not you ever speak to me about mistakes," Olivia Susan snarled. "You think your father is a saint. You think we live in this mansion because he is a brilliant businessman. He is a fraud. He has always been a fraud." "Susan, what are you doing?" Richard warned, his voice trembling. "Shut up, Richard!" Susan screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am done lying for you. You want to know whose fault this is, Olivia. Ask your father where he got the designs for the manufacturing plant. Ask him how he got the capital to buy this house. He stole it. He stole every single penny from Clara's real father." Thomas Vance built that company, and Richard drove him into the ground and forged the paperwork to take it all. You knew, Olivia whispered, her voice filled with sudden, horrifying realization. Of course I knew. Susan wept, a wet, hysterical sound of total moral collapse. I knew he was a thief. I knew he destroyed an innocent man. But I wanted the diamond earrings. I wanted the country club memberships. I wanted the private schools for you. I stayed silent for the money. And I let him treat Clara like garbage to protect our secret. We built this entire life on a lie, and now the lie is over. We deserve this. We deserve all of it. I sat in my velvet chair, staring out at the beautiful city skyline. I listened as the recording devolved into a chorus of sobbing screaming and the sound of distant police sirens approaching the estate, likely called by a terrified neighbor. I reached forward and pressed a button, saving the audio file. I immediately forwarded the encrypted recording to Marcus and archived copies on 3 separate secure offshore servers. They had turned their greed against each other, destroying their family from the inside out. I had not laid a single finger on them. I simply held up a mirror and allowed them to tear themselves to pieces. The repossession was officially complete. The dawn brought a relentless driving rain that washed the city streets clean. I sat at my desk watching the storm batter the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The digital file containing the forensic audit of Jamal's embezzlement sat on my desktop, fully encrypted and meticulously organized. It contained every wire transfer, every dummy corporation, and every fraudulent loan document tying Richard's personal estate to the stolen corporate funds. I did not swoop in to offer a compromise or a last-minute settlement. I picked up my phone and authorized Marcus to transmit the entire unredacted audit directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and the Regional Field Office of the FBI. With the federal authorities activated, I initiated the physical execution of the eviction. The 30-day grace period I had initially offered was contingent upon a cessation of illicit activities, a clause Jamal and Richard had already violated by attempting to move assets offshore in the wake of my ultimatum. I dispatched my private security team to accompany the local county sheriffs to the industrial park. From my tablet, I watched the live encrypted feed from my lead contractor's lapel camera. The heavy iron gates of Wilson Manufacturing were chained and padlocked. Uniformed deputies stood posted at every entrance, turning away the morning shift workers. When Richard's black Mercedes pulled up to the curb, he did not step out with his usual arrogant stride. He stumbled out into the pouring rain, his tailored suit instantly ruined, screaming at the deputies who simply held up their hands and pointed to the massive eviction notice plastered across the glass lobby doors. He was a king locked out of his own castle, pounding his fists against the glass until his knuckles bled. My desk phone chimed, cutting through the quiet hum of my office. My assistant informed me that a frantic woman was in the lobby demanding to see me. She had refused to leave and was currently dripping water all over the Italian marble floors. I knew exactly who it was before her name was even spoken. I instructed security to send her up. When the heavy oak doors to my office opened, the figure that stepped inside was entirely unrecognizable from the haughty, perfectly manicured woman who had mocked my existence for 3 decades. Olivia was drenched, her expensive blonde hair plastered to her cheeks, her mascara running in dark, jagged streaks down her face. She was not carrying a designer handbag, she was clutching a soaked manila envelope. The sheer suffocating arrogance that had defined her entire life had been completely stripped away, replaced by the raw, trembling panic of a woman who had just realized the floor had vanished beneath her feet. "Clara," she sobbed, her voice cracking as she practically collapsed into the guest chair opposite my desk. "Clara, please, you have to help me. You have to." I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. I did not offer her a towel. I did not offer her a glass of water. I simply watched her unravel. "Jamal is gone," she gasped, her chest heaving as she wiped her face with a shaking hand. "He packed a bag in the middle of the night and left. The federal agents were at my house this morning. They froze all my personal accounts. They seized my car. Clara, they are going to arrest him for fraud, and they think I knew about it. They think I helped him hide the money." "Did you?" I asked, my voice flat and entirely devoid of sympathy. "No, I just spent it," she shrieked, a desperate, pathetic admission. "I didn't know where it came from, I swear. But Dad won't even answer my calls. He's locked himself in the study, and Mom is just drinking and crying. I have absolutely nothing, Clara. The bank is foreclosing on our house today. She slid out of the chair, dropping to her knees on the floor in front of my desk. It was the ultimate surrender. I need a job, she begged, looking up at me with wild, bloodshot eyes. I need a personal loan, just enough cash to get out of the city to hire a defense attorney before the feds issue a warrant. I'll do anything. I'll work in the mailroom. I'll clean the floors. We're sisters, Clara. Please, you cannot let them put me in prison. You have all this money now. A loan wouldn't mean anything to you. I looked down at the golden child sister who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. I thought about the birthdays where she opened my presents, the family dinners where she mocked my ambitions, and the sneer on her face when she told me I would never amount to anything more than a glorified shop girl. Get up off my floor, Olivia. I commanded, the absolute zero temperature of my voice causing her to freeze. You are ruining the carpet. She slowly scrambled back to her feet, her hands clutching the edge of my desk, waiting for a lifeline that was never going to come. You do not understand the definition of independence. I said, my gaze locking onto hers with lethal intensity. You spent your entire life believing that success was an inheritance. You thought that wealth and respect were things handed to you on a silver platter simply because you possessed the correct last name. You laughed while I was handed scraps, and you cheered when your father told me my only worth was finding a rich man to fund my existence. I was wrong, she sobbed, fresh tears spilling over her eyelashes. I was so wrong, Clara. I'm sorry. You are not sorry for what you did, I corrected smoothly. You are exclusively sorry that you have been caught. True independence is earned through fire, Olivia. It is forged in the late nights, the constant rejection, and the absolute refusal to rely on anyone but yourself. You never learned how to build a fire. You only knew how to warm your hands on the ones your father stole from better men. She shook her head, a pathetic whimpering sound escaping her throat. I will not give you a job, I stated, delivering the ultimate rejection with perfectly measured pacing. I will not give you a personal loan. I will not shield you from the federal authorities, and I will certainly not fund your escape from the consequences of your own parasitic greed. I pressed the button on my intercom, instantly summoning the two security contractors waiting in the hallway. You wanted to be the sole heir to the family legacy, Olivia, I said, a dark, triumphant smile finally breaking across my face as the security guard stepped into the room and took her by the arms. Congratulations, you get to inherit all of Richard's debts. Clara, no, please, she screamed, thrashing wildly against the unyielding grip of the guards as they dragged her backward toward the doors. You can't do this. We are family. We were never family, I replied, turning my attention back to the monitors on my desk. Take her out the back freight elevator. I do not want her disturbing the actual professionals in the lobby. Her screams echoed down the corridor until the heavy doors sealed shut, leaving my office in absolute blissful silence. The fallout over the next 48 hours was absolute and irrevocable. With the gates of Wilson Manufacturing padlocked by the sheriff's department and the company's operating capital frozen by my injunction, Richard missed payroll. It was the final fatal domino. His creditors descended like a flock of starving vultures. The business was forced into immediate receivership. The IRS initiated a massive, crippling audit of every financial ledger, uncovering decades of tax evasion masking the stolen capital. The empire Richard had built on my father's stolen genius was systematically dismantled. The stamping machines, the inventory, the raw materials, everything was seized, cataloged, and auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The Blackwell name once synonymous with untouchable industrial wealth, became a toxic punchline in the financial district. They had lost their company, their mansion, and their freedom. I had taken back exactly what was mine, leaving them with the only thing they truly earned: nothing. The collapse of Wilson Manufacturing was not a slow, agonizing decline. It was a swift, brutal execution. Once the doors were padlocked and the IRS initiated their forensic sweep, the corporate carcass was stripped bare within weeks. Richard's remaining board members fled like rats from a sinking ship, leaving him entirely alone to face the catastrophic fallout of his own greed. When the bankruptcy auction was finally scheduled, the atmosphere in the federal courthouse was clinically cold. I sat in the back row with Ethan and our lead legal counsel watching the proceedings with absolute detachment. Richard was present flanked by a bargain-rate public defender he could barely afford. His bespoke suits had been replaced by a wrinkled off-the-rack jacket that hung loosely on his rapidly shrinking frame. He did not look in my direction. He simply stared straight ahead, his eyes hollow and dead. The auction itself was a mere formality. My private equity firm Vanguard Holdings was the only entity with the capital and the insider knowledge to sweep the board. We acquired the entirety of Richard's remaining assets, the manufacturing patents, the supply chain contracts, and the heavy machinery for literal pennies on the dollar. During the final asset transfer, Marcus handed me the digital dossier containing the absolute proof of our victory. I scrolled through the encrypted manifest. The primary acquisition schedule, titled exactly as Duyan Mayu 121.docx, detailed the total reversion of the original patents back to my control. The secondary asset liquidation ledger, filed under Duyan Mayu 22121.cx, confirmed that every single piece of stolen intellectual property had been legally cleansed and restored to its rightful ownership. I had done it. I had meticulously reconstructed the brilliant legacy my biological father, Thomas Vance, had bled for. The empire was finally back in the hands of the bloodline that actually built it. The personal devastation for the Blackwell family was far more thorough than their corporate ruin. The federal authorities did not show leniency to Jamal. The evidence of his wire fraud and international money laundering was irrefutable. The final prosecution brief, catalogued in the district attorney's database as Duyan Mao 32111.docx, guaranteed he would spend the next 15 years in a federal penitentiary. He was escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, weeping audibly, completely abandoned by the family he had bankrupted himself trying to impress. Richard faced a different kind of prison. The IRS seized whatever microscopic capital remained in his hidden accounts to cover the massive penalties for decades of tax evasion. But his true punishment was the absolute total social exile. The man who had defined his entire existence by his prestige and his proximity to power was abruptly and entirely erased from polite society. His memberships to the elite country clubs were instantly revoked. The board of directors for the local charities he used to sponsor publicly disassociated themselves from his name. I heard through the financial grapevine that he had attempted to show up at his beloved Oak Ridge Country Club to beg for a temporary grace period on his dues. The security staff men he had completely ignored for 30 years politely but firmly escorted him off the premises. He was left standing in the gravel parking lot staring at the manicured greens he would never walk again. He spent his days sitting on public benches near the financial district, wearing the same fading suit, watching the executives walk past him. He was a ghost haunting the perimeter of a world that had completely expelled him. He was bankrupt, disgraced, and utterly forgotten. For Susan and Olivia, the descent into poverty was a profound psychological shattering. The sprawling suburban mansion was foreclosed upon and immediately seized by the bank. Stripped of their designer wardrobes, their imported cars, and their bottomless credit lines, they were abruptly forced to navigate a reality they had spent their entire lives mocking. They relocated to a cramped, run-down two-bedroom apartment on the industrial outskirts of the city. The contrast was poetic. The woman who had once complained about the thread count of Egyptian cotton sheets was now forced to share a single drafty bathroom with a daughter who blamed her for their mutual destruction. They had no domestic staff to clean up their messes, no caterers to prepare their meals, and absolutely no social circle left to validate their existence. The walls of their new reality were paper thin, allowing the sounds of sirens and street traffic to constantly interrupt their bitter, echoing arguments. The final eviction confirmation from their luxury estate. A document I retained a copy of, named Duyan Mao 421.docx, marked the definitive end of their reign of arrogance. I knew Olivia had attempted to secure employment at several high-end retail boutiques, relying on her former status as a VIP client. Each manager, fully aware of the highly publicized Blackwell scandal, had quietly shown her the door. Olivia, who had once demanded I be grateful for the scraps she left behind, was now surviving on the very same scraps. They were entirely cut off from the wealth they had once hoarded, trapped in a purgatory of their own making. I did not feel sorry for them. I felt absolutely nothing at all. The heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations, their cruelty, and their endless demands had been completely lifted from my shoulders. 6 months later, the transition was fully complete. Vanguard Holdings had integrated the newly reclaimed manufacturing assets, rebranding the entire division under the name Vance Innovations. Profits were soaring, the ethical rot had been entirely excised, and the industry was eagerly watching our next move. I stood on the expansive wraparound balcony of the newly acquired $12 million waterfront property. The night air was crisp and clean. Below me, the city stretched out in a brilliant, glittering grid of endless possibilities. The distant hum of traffic blended with the gentle sound of the dark water lapping against the private dock. The gentle breeze caught the edge of my silk dress. I breathed in the scent of the ocean and the sharp metallic tang of the city. I had not just survived their cruelty, I had weaponized it. Every insult, every slight, every moment of isolation had been the fuel I used to forge my empire. Ethan stepped out onto the terrace carrying 2 crystal flutes and a bottle of vintage champagne. He handed me a glass, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights. To Thomas Vance, Ethan said quietly, raising his glass. And to the woman who finally brought his empire home. To Thomas, I replied, clinking my glass against his. The pure crystalline chime rang out into the night sky. I took a slow sip of the cold champagne, letting the physical reality of the moment anchor me. I looked out at the towering skyscrapers, the financial district, where I had systematically dismantled the monsters of my past. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the quiet, overlooked girl hiding in the shadows of a stolen mansion. I had walked through the fire they had set for me, and I had emerged completely untouched. I was finally free, entirely autonomous, and the undisputed master of my own life. Reclaiming the skyline was only the beginning.